Hello everyone, thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, you might as well listen to this story, and maybe you will fall asleep soon. Before listening, please like and subscribe first. Of course, the premise is that you really like my content. If you have any thoughts or feelings, please leave a message below. Your opinions will really help me grow. Okay, enough chit-chat. Let's get started. My hands holding the satellite map were chilled by the sea mist. The moment the boat hit the beach, 6 barefoot fishermen stood up from behind the rocks, like 6 stone statues swollen by the tide. Tanjin Fishing Village. I raised my voice. No one answered. In the past 3 months, 13 fishermen have disappeared here. The front page of the Jakarta Times marked "New Human Trafficking Route in Southeast Asia" with a red frame. I carried the list and the recorder to expose this conspiracy. The old boatman patted my backpack and said, "Put your camera away securely." He pointed to the shore. A middle-aged woman in the front row was scratching her palms with her fingernails, blood dripping from her fingers onto the sand. They don't like strangers wearing eyes. As I stuffed my camera into my inner pocket, I glimpsed the bamboo basket at the woman's feet. The basket was filled with faded silver ornaments, each one carved with a baby's face. 3 strings of copper bells are hung at the entrance of the village. When I counted to the 7th step, the copper bell suddenly rang. An old man in a coarse cloth coat sat on the blue stone slab with a hemp rope tied around his wrists and was ringing a bell with a copper rod. His face was wrinkled like dried seaweed, and he didn't even raise his eyelids. Stranger. Elliot Quinn, the Jakarta Times. I pulled out my press card. The old man's copper rod stopped in midair, and the lingering sound of the bell scraped across the eardrum. He suddenly laughed. Reporter. Last month, there was a documentary filmmaker, and now he is feeding the fish in the tideless area. The hotel is at the end of the village, with a faded word "peace" pasted on the wooden door. When the lady boss collected 500 rupees from me, dark brown stains appeared between her fingernails. "Don't open the back window." She slammed the key on the counter. The sound of the foggy night. Once you answer it, you can't take it back. Rear window. I was standing in a second-floor room, with its windows boarded shut. The moonlight leaked in through the cracks in the wooden boards, shining on the diary on the bedside table. Sulia said she would deliver the diary page to her husband at 9 o'clock, and now the clock pointed to 9:17. There was a light knock on the door. When I opened the door, the woman was holding a faded rag doll in her arms. She was wearing a blue shirt, and her hair was neatly combed, as if she had just attended a funeral. My husband was the second one to disappear. She put a piece of paper in my palm. He wrote this 3 days before he disappeared. The edges of the page were charred, and the words were written in pencil, blurred by the seawater. The fog came, and the crying sound climbed up from the bottom of the sea. "It knows my daughter's nickname, and the leg I broke on the dock last winter. Does your husband have the habit of taking notes?" I took out a recorder. Lydia Sue's fingers suddenly pinched my wrist with surprising force. Her eyes were abnormally bright, like 2 lights that were about to go out. "Don't record it." She loosened her hand, and the puppet fell to the ground, revealing the baby's hair stuffed inside. "It will learn." At 2 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by crying. Not just any baby cry. The sound was like someone grabbing my throat, with a sharp sound like metal scraping, and it came in through the gap between the wooden boards of the rear window. I groped in the dark for my cell phone's flashlight, and shone the light onto the wooden board. A light green mist was seeping out of the cracks, and was flowing down the wall like some kind of living thing. The recorder is still on. I moved closer to the board, trying to determine the direction of the crying. Suddenly, my left ear felt like being pricked by a needle. I turned my head suddenly. The same crying sound was heard again from the right wall. Both directions, half a second apart. My hands holding the recorder were shaking. I also heard this kind of overlapping sound when investigating a mining accident 3 months ago. It was the sound of explosions reflecting through the ventilation ducts. But this is a closed rear window. Where does the reflection come from? I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. At dawn, I went to the dock with a recorder. Omar sat in an abandoned fishing boat, striking a smaller bell with a brass rod. He looked up and saw me, sneering. "What did you record?" I called up the recording. I heard a baby crying on the phone, but after just 3 seconds, Omar suddenly hit the board with a copper rod. "Stop." The veins on his neck popped out. "This is not real crying." He took out a crumpled paper from his pocket and stuffed it into my palm. My son drew this before he disappeared. There were grains of salt on the edges of the sketch. The painting shows a reef with a claw sticking out from the crevice, 5 curved toes, each like a rusty fishhook, with mucus dripping from the tip. "It's learning." Omar's voice suddenly lowered. "First it learns to be a baby, then it learns to be your mother calling you to eat, and finally," he didn't finish his words, stood up and walked towards the village, the copper bell jingling at his waist. At low tide in the evening, I walked on the wet sand towards the rocky beach. The missing fishermen were last seen behind the 3rd reef, with coordinates marked on the satellite map. There were 2 drag marks on the sand. With an eerie sheen, I squatted down, and when my fingertips touched the sand, it felt like touching jelly just taken out of the refrigerator, cold, sticky, and with a smell of rust. The tide table showed that the tide had been low for 6 hours. Normal traces of seawater should have dried up long ago, but this drag mark is still oozing mucus. I pulled out a small instrument for measuring humidity. The readings jumped rapidly, reaching as high as 90%. The wind suddenly blew behind me. The fog seemed to be pulled by someone and instantly wrapped around my waist. Something brushed the back of my neck, as cold as fingers soaked in seawater. I turned around suddenly. The sound of a baby crying rang in my ears. The sound was clearer than last night, with a slightly childish ending, as if there really was a child left in the fog. I took 2 steps back and stepped into the sea. When the fog cleared a little, there was nothing on the sand except a faint claw mark next to my footprint, exactly the same as in the sketch Omar gave me. When I returned to the village chief Adianto was standing at the door of the hotel. He wore a white shirt and a gold watch, which made him look very different from other fishermen in the village. "Mr. Quinn," he said politely, "the villagers said you were asking about missing people everywhere." He pointed at the recorder on my chest. It affected my mood. I was about to speak when he turned and left. The wind lifted the corner of his clothes, and I saw a silver object tucked into his waist. It was a gun with a baby's face engraved on the handle, exactly the same as the silver ornaments in the bamboo basket at the entrance of the village. The boards on the rear window had been removed. I stood in the room, looking at the empty windows in the moonlight. The sea breeze blew in, bringing with it a faint scent of milk. Someone put a strand of baby's hair on the diary on the bedside table. I pinched the hair and suddenly heard Lydia Sue's voice coming from downstairs. She was singing a lullaby. The tune was soft, but every word was like a nail drilling into my brain. "Be good, baby. Come with Mom to see the sea." The fog outside the window suddenly thickened. I heard something crawling along the wall, little by little towards the window. I turned over on the hardwood bed in the hotel, and the coolness of the mist still lingered on the back of my neck. The ringing of the copper bell outside the window has never stopped since the second half of the night, Omar's vigil bell. It was just daybreak when I walked towards Nora's house with my recorder. She is the sister of the 3rd missing fisherman. Yesterday, when she was helping someone mend a fishing net at the entrance of the village, her fingers were pricked and covered in blood, but she didn't say a word. This silence is so abnormal. I have to ask clearly. He was stopped before he reached the entrance of the alley. Village Chief Adianto stood in the middle of the road, his white shirt pressed neatly, his gold watch dazzling in the morning light. "Mr. Quinn," he stretched out his hand to block me. "The villagers said you ask too many questions. I'm investigating a missing persons case. I stuffed the recorder into my pocket. The disappearance is a natural disaster. He smiled and tapped his temple with his knuckles. If you ask too many questions, they'll go crazy. I stared at the small of his back. The butt of the gun I saw last night was still there, and the notch of a baby's face was faintly visible under his shirt. Then I'll go to the grocery store to buy batteries. I turned and walked towards the east end of the village. The grocery store owner was an old lady who huddled behind the counter. On the shelves were salt, plastic basins, and a row of glass jars covered with yellow paper. I bent down to look for batteries, and my eyes swept across the bottom shelf. 7 empty bottles were neatly stacked, with the labels torn to the point that only the 4 words GT Shen Oil were left. "You want AA batteries?" the old lady said suddenly, digging her nails into the back of my hand. I pulled out my phone to take a quick photo, but she had already rushed over to stuff the empty bottle under the counter. "No more," she gurgled in her throat. "No more." When I returned to the hotel, the cell phone in my trouser pocket vibrated. In the photo, there were dark brown marks on the bottom of the empty bottle, like coagulated blood. At 11 o'clock at night, I was lying on the table organizing my notes. The first missing person, Omar's son, who said he heard a baby crying before going out to sea. The second, the fishing boat was found at the edge of the flat zone, with 3 anchor ropes broken. The third, Nora's brother, who had a background noise in the last call. The sound of a baby crying came in from the window. I froze. This time, it wasn't just crying. It was mixed with a hoarse ending, just like minus "Elliot, come back." The voice was as light as a feather. "Don't sleep alone too late." I stood up suddenly, and the chair fell to the ground. Memories of when I was 12 suddenly came flooding back. The swimming pool water overflowed my mother's head, and she shouted these words as she struggled with the unique Javanese bar drawl. I took out my recorder and pressed the record button. The crying sound wrapped in my mother's voice poured in. My hands were shaking so much that I couldn't hold the pen. The recording button clicked 3 times before I finally pressed it firmly. When the crying stopped, I replayed it tremblingly. "Come back. Don't sleep too late alone." It was exactly as I remembered. I even copied the slight sound of my mother's tongue, tip pressing against the roof of her mouth when she spoke. That was her habit when she was teaching me Javanese. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door. Omar's home is at the end of the village. A faded red cloth is hung on the gate of the courtyard, and the smell of incense leaks through the crack of the door. "It's eating your memories." Omar held up the incense, sparks flickering in the mist. "It learns what you fear. It sings whatever hurts you." He pointed at the map on the wall and tapped the red area with his pipe. "No tide zone. All anchors will point here in the end." The village chief's gun. "Hush." Omar suddenly blew out the incense. "It's coming." Outside the window came the rustling sound of vines rubbing against the wall. I took out the miniature wind vane from my pocket. The needle was spinning wildly. The mist was not floating naturally, but was swirling around something. The sound of crying came from the window. This time it was my own voice. "Come with me to see the sea." I tore open the recorder, pressed the speaker against the glass, and pressed the reverse play button. There was a sharp noise, like metal scraping glass. It suddenly became quiet outside the window. I moved closer to the window. In the moonlight, I saw claw marks on the window frame, 5 curved hooks, exactly as Omar had sketched. "Tomorrow," Omar said, pouring the ashes into a clay pot. "Come with me to Rocky Beach." I stared at the slime oozing from the claw marks, and the chill on the back of my neck began to build again. Tomorrow. Rocky Beach. There lay the first of the gnawed corpses. At 5 in the morning of the next day, Omar knocked on my door. He held a canvas bag tightly in his hand, with half of a rusty shovel sticking out of the bag. "The tide has receded to its lowest point." His voice was as hoarse as sandpaper. "Ivan's bones are still stuck in the cracks of the reef." The rocky beach was filled with a pungent fishy smell that made it difficult to open one's eyes. I squatted between two dark brown reefs and saw half a skeleton. The ribs were broken into 3 pieces, and there were semicircular teeth marks on the clavicle. Omar used a shovel to push away the clinging seaweed, revealing half of the mandible with some rotten flesh still on it. Don't look at his face. He kicked the scraps of cloth beside him with the tip of his shoe. He was wearing a blue shirt on the day he disappeared. I took out my magnifying glass. There was something translucent stuck in the crack of the nail of the deceased's right little finger, like half-melted isinglass. I sniffed it up close, and the fishy smell went straight into my nose. It was a different smell from that of ordinary fish viscera, with a hint of rust as well. Take a picture of it. Omar handed over the phone. Compare it with the claw marks on the window frame last night. The moment the photos overlapped, I got goosebumps on the back of my neck. The edges of the mucus between my fingernails matched the patterns of the moist substance oozing out from around the claw marks. This is the saliva of the sea baby. Omar dug the shovel into the sand. Before it drags you into the water, it scratches you with its claws. On the way back to the hotel, I detoured to the village office to check the tide table. The dates of the 3 missing records are July 12, August 3, and August 25, and the corresponding water level lines in the tide-free areas are all marked as still. I connected these 3 coordinates with a red pen, and the tip of the pen stopped at the edge of the fog belt. The curve was like a straightened rope, tightly tying the fog area 3 kilometers away. In the evening, Nora knocked on my window. She was holding a cloth bag, and her hair was dripping with water, as if she had just crawled out of the sea. This is what my brother left behind. She handed me a crumpled piece of paper and turned away. Her footsteps were so light that they were almost inaudible, like a leaf blown by the wind. The words on the note were blurred by the water and could be barely recognized. There is light in the fog and shadow in the light. At the end, a crooked fish was drawn. The fish's eyes were 2 circles that looked like tears. Crying fish. I looked at it under the desk lamp, and a little light blue seeped into the ink, like some kind of seawater crystal. The 7th night came faster than the previous ones. Just after 10 o'clock, cold air began to pour in through the window cracks. I tucked the notebook under my pillow. It read, "The sea infant is able to read conversational memories." Nora's voice, which Omar and I mentioned when we were discussing her brother. "Please save my brother." The crying sound came in right next to my ear. It was the tail end of Nora's voice, trembling with tears. I bit my lip and counted for a few seconds. When I counted to the 7th time, the voice changed. "Do you know how he died?" "He was dragged into the sea, and his lungs were filled with salt water." I said to the wall, "The memory you copied is clearer than mine." The vines outside the window suddenly shook violently. I touched the recorder on the bedside table, and my palms were full of sweat. "Come with me to see the sea." This time it was my own voice, with the trembling sound of a 12-year-old. "Mom is waiting for you." I raised my head suddenly. The moonlight shone through the vines onto the glass, casting a blurry shadow, 5 hooked claws clinging to the window frame, the skin glowing with a slippery luster, like the belly of a fish that had been soaked for 3 days. The tip of my tongue suddenly tasted of rust. I bit my mouth. I grabbed the recorder, plugged it into the socket, and pressed the high-frequency white noise button. A sharp buzzing sound exploded. The shadows outside the window began to distort, making a scream similar to the friction of metal. I saw its claws scratching sparks on the glass, and slime flowing down the window frame and dripping onto the wood of the windowsill, hissing and emitting white smoke. When the sound stopped, it was already dawn. There was a new footprint on the windowsill, 5 toes with a rusty anchor embedded in the middle. There was a little light blue crystal hanging on the anchor tooth, exactly the same color as the ink on Nora's note. I raised my phone to take a picture. In the lens, a blurry letter E was engraved on the anchor. Those are my mother's initials. I zoomed in on the photo of the footprints on my phone, and the E on the anchor was enlarged to fill the entire screen. At 3 in the morning, The hotel lamp cast a swaying shadow on the wall. I dug out the missing persons file that I secretly photographed from the village office 3 days ago. The last time each fisherman was seen was in the reef zone at the edge of the tideless area. I spread out the photos of their anchors one by one, and suddenly gasped. The same light blue crystals were embedded in the teeth of all the anchors. There is a Swiss Army knife in the drawer of the bedside table, which I picked up at the dock grocery store the day before yesterday. I disassembled the recorder, soldered the micro speaker to the main board, and fished out a button battery from my backpack. It was taken from the old radio hanging on Omar's waist when I noticed him ringing the bell yesterday. High-frequency white noise makes that thing miserable. I need more power. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the door curtain of the grocery store was lifted by the sea breeze. The proprietress dozed off at the counter while Indonesian folk songs played on the radio. I reached for the glass jar at the back of the shelf. On the label was written in crayon, anti-cry oil, which Nora had mentioned last week, saying that the old-timers made it from spermaceti and wormwood to drown out the cries in the sea fog. As my hand just touched the jar, the proprietress suddenly coughed. My heart jumped into my throat. When I stuffed the jar into the inner pocket of my jacket, my back was already wet. On the way back to the hotel, the fog wrapped around my ankles like wet cotton. I always felt like something was following me, but when I turned around, I could only see my own shadow stretched out by the streetlights and twisted into the shape of 5 toes on the ground. It was 10 o'clock in the evening, and the knock on the door was lighter than the sound of a mosquito's wings. My hand holding the screwdriver was covered in cold sweat, and I slowly moved to the door. Looking out through the peephole, I could see Nora's profile. Water was dripping from the ends of her hair, forming small puddles on the floor. Her blue skirt stuck to her legs, as if she had just been fished out of the sea. "You can't go." Her voice was like cotton thread soaked in water. "That's not the sea. It's a dream." I was about to ask when she turned and left. The sound of slippers tapping on the wooden stairs became lighter and lighter, and finally disappeared at the corner of the stairs. When I chased after her, the only sound echoing in the corridor was my own footsteps. The puddles were still on the ground, but there were no footprints left by her, only 5 semicircular wet marks, as if they had been wiped by some hooked claws. In the second half of the night, I dozed off against the head of the bed and fell into a dark blue water in a daze. Translucent shadows were swimming around, some curled up like babies, some with 5 long thin claws stretched out. Their cries mixed with the water and turned into the humming sound of instruments that I heard in the hospital when I was 12 years old. When my mother opened her eyes for the last time, I was also soaked in the smell of disinfectant and listening to the ticking sound of the monitor. "You've been here a long time ago." A voice came close to my ear, like the muffled sound of seawater pouring into my nose. I wanted to struggle, but found that my hands had become translucent, and tiny claws grew on my fingertips. With a ding sound, I woke up suddenly and saw a photo on the bedside. The edge of the photo paper was yellow. It was a photo of me and my mother at the beach when I was a child. The color of the sea was exactly the same as in my dream just now. There were words on the back of the photo, the ink not yet dry, rubbing against my fingertips, "Don't forget whose child you are." When I knocked for the 3rd time, the wooden door of the village chief's house opened a crack. Adianto's face was hidden in the shadows, revealing only a pair of red eyes. "The answer you're looking for is in the tidal zone," I said bluntly, "but I need a boat and a tide table." "Go back." His voice was like the sound of sandpaper rubbing against each other. "Go back to Jakarta now, or it will remember your voice, your smell, and your every heartbeat." As the door was about to close, I caught a glimpse of dark brown liquid oozing from the gauze wrapped around his wrist. He hastily pulled his hand back, but I could see clearly the edge of the gauze, 5 crescent-shaped bloodstains, exactly the same as the claw marks on the windowsill. At 5 in the morning, Omar was waiting for me at the dock. His copper bells were strung on a thick linen rope, making a tiny tinkling sound, like the sound that used to remind villagers to close their windows every night. This is the last line of defense. He put the bell in my palm. If it starts to learn to speak like you do. The old man's Adam's apple moved. Sing your favorite song when you were a child. Stars falling into the Banda Sea. I nodded and tied the copper bell around my wrist. The sound of the boat's motor scared away several seabirds, and their cries mixed in the fog, sounding like a baby crying. As the oars cut through the water, I suddenly heard a sob behind me. It was my voice, trembling with the sound of a 12-year-old, and the tail tone was made sticky by the seawater. "Mom, I'm scared." The fog was suddenly so thick that the reef 10 meters away could not be seen. I gripped the rudder tightly, but found that the water under the oar was abnormally calm. No waves, no surges, and even the ripples at the stern seemed to be paused. There was a scraping sound under the boat, as if something was scratching the wood with its claws. I looked down and saw a light blue crystal floating under the water, gleaming in the moonlight, exactly the same as the ink on Nora's note and on the anchors of all the missing people. Suddenly the oar got stuck. I looked down. The water was as blue as solidified glass, and the scraping sounds on the bottom of the boat became louder. The copper bell that Omar gave me shattered on my wrist, but the sound was mostly swallowed up by the fog, leaving only a buzzing vibration. "Mom, I'm scared." The crying sound that brushed against the back of my neck was the last note of me in the hospital when I was 12 years old. At that time I was holding my mother's hand. Her fingers slowly grew cold as the monitor ticked. Now the sound is wrapped in the smell of the sea, as if someone has soaked my memories in a saltwater tank. The fog suddenly condensed into grayish-white silk flakes and floated beside the boat. I reached for my waist. The high-frequency ultrasonic device that Omar had stuffed into my pocket before we left was still there. I originally used this thing to record the fisherman's oral statements. He said sea babies are afraid of high-frequency vibrations. I didn't believe it, but at this moment, my palms were full of sweat, and I was shaking violently when I pressed the switch. Bite. A sharp buzzing sound tore through the mist. I saw them. The translucent body twisted in the sound waves. The 5 claws were bluish-gray, and blurry blood vessels floated under the skin. The face of the one in the front was changing. First it turned into Nora's round eyes, then into Sulia's bunted black hair, and finally it grew into a hooked nose like mine. "Elliot," Nora's voice came out of its throat. "You promised to help me find my brother." I held on to the oar tightly. 3 days ago, Nora squatted on the rocky beach and cried. Her brother's anchor was stuck in the cracks of the rocks, and there were light blue crystals in the rust. She slipped me a note, and the smudged ink was the same blue. "That's the bait of the sea babies," Omar said, smoking a pipe. "They use memory as a net to catch the soft-hearted." The bottom of the boat was suddenly lifted up. I staggered and held onto the side of the boat, and saw more figures floating up from the water, the missing fishermen. Old Pani's fishing fork was still stuck in his waist, and Amir's life jacket had a hole in it. Their eyes were all cloudy white, and they repeated, "Go to the tideless area. Watch the sea with me. Don't be afraid, Mom." "It's not a ghost," I said to the air, as if trying to convince myself. "It's a copied after image." The sound of the Sonicator's current hurt my ears. I followed the fisherman's gaze and looked where the fog was thickest, where there was a huge whirlpool. An egg-shaped object floated in the center of the vortex, with human eyes, lips, and nose protruding on its surface, some of which were slowly opening and closing, as if screaming silently. "Stay." This time it was my mother's voice. I turned my head suddenly, and the oar broke into 2 pieces with a snap. The smell of disinfectant wafted through the fog. I, 12 years old, stood in front of the hospital bed again. My mother's hand slipped through my fingers. The long beep of the monitor mixed with the sound of waves exploded in my head. "You don't belong on land." This is my voice, as an adult, with the calmness that comes with investigation. I fished out a small glass bottle from my pocket, Omar said. It contained wormwood soaked in coconut oil for 7 nights, called crying-stopping balm. As soon as the bottle mouth was unscrewed, the sea babies suddenly retreated half a meter, and mucus dripped onto the deck, corroding small holes. I smeared the scented oil on the side of the boat. The moment the bitter fragrance rose, all the facial features on the egg-shaped object became distorted. I picked up the copper bell, and the sound of metal collision mixed with the smell of fragrant oil cut through a blank space. "Lydia Sue," I shouted. 3 days ago, she was sitting on the doorstep mending her fishing nets, and said when my husband left, he said to see the sea, and I believe he went to a good place. Now she whispered from within the ovoid, "We are not victims, we are sacrifices." My heart suddenly sank. The old people always say, it's hard to respond to a baby's cry on a foggy night, but every Qingming festival, there will be a few fewer fishermen in the village. The claw marks on Adianto's wrist, the sketch of the reef monster claws on Omar's son, and the anchor of Nora's brother. It turns out that they knew that exchanging a living person for a sea baby would avoid disaster. "Elliot." Nora's voice sounded again, this time with a crying tone. I looked up and saw her standing in front of the egg-shaped object, wearing the blue cloth skirt she wore that day, with seawater dripping from the ends of her hair. "Look, my brother is waiting for me." I bit my tongue. The sweet smell of blood rushed into his throat, and Nora in front of him suddenly split apart. The hooked claws of the sea baby were revealed in the translucent body. "Fuck your sacrifice," I roared, clenched the copper bell and smashed it at the egg-shaped object. The dull sound of metal colliding hurt my eardrums. Spiderweb cracks appeared on the surface of the egg, the sea baby screamed, and mucus sprayed all over my face. I reached for the sonicator's detonator button. Omar had said, "If you push me too far, I'll blow it up." Now the blood vessels on the back of my hand were throbbing, as if they were about to burst. Boom. Everything went white. When I opened my eyes again, the salty seawater was pouring into my nasal cavity. I lay on the rocky beach, soaking wet, holding an anchor in my right hand, an anchor with 5-toed paw prints engraved on it, exactly the same as the one Nora's brother had. Woke up. The smell of Omar's tobacco wafted over. He was squatting beside me, with the copper bells on his wrist, making a slight sound when they collided with the one I had tied before. The old man's eyes were very red, as if he had just cried. "The eggs exploded," I said in a hoarse voice. "The sea babies are not dead." He put out his pipe on the reef. "Their eggs have long since been scattered into the sea." A baby cries in the distance. I pulled myself up. The fog over the Banda Sea had thickened again, covering the village like a grey cloth. The lights were on in the windows of Adianto's house. Sulia's fishing net was still draped over the fence, and Nora's blue skirt was hanging on the clothesline, swaying in the wind. The copper bell on my wrist suddenly rang by itself. I looked down and saw a drop of light blue liquid seeping out from the claw mark on the anchor. I was pulled up by Omar. His rough palm pinched my arm, like pulling a fish just pulled ashore. The reef hurt my knees, and I still held the anchor in my right hand. The blue liquid from the claw marks flowed down through my fingers, sticky like melted snot. "Let's go," Omar said in a muffled voice, and the smell of dry tobacco wrapped in the sea breeze went into my throat. I staggered after him into the village, my wet clothes sticking to my back and falling down with every step. 3 women were sitting under the old banyan tree at the entrance of the village, weaving fishing nets. One of them looked up as I passed. It was Aunt Nora. Her eyelids twitched, and she lowered her head to adjust the net ropes, as if I were a transparent reef. "They can't see me." My throat tightened. Omar didn't answer, but pushed me into the wooden door of the hotel. The old lady at the front desk was wiping the table with a coconut shell. She looked up and smiled at me. "Mr. Elliot, you're back." I stood there in a daze. The day I left the hotel and went to the tide-free area, the old lady clearly told me, "Don't run around in heavy fog." But now her eyes were clear, as if I had just gone out to buy a pack of cigarettes. Tea. Lydia Sue came out from the inner room, holding a celadon cup, There were fish scales on her apron, and the ends of her hair were still dry. They were still dripping with seawater when she handed me the fishing net 3 days ago. When I took the cup, my fingertips touched the back of her hand, which was as cold as ice. There was a layer of dark yellow oil floating at the bottom of the cup. I leaned over to smell it, and a bitter fragrance suddenly rushed into my nostrils. It was the cry-stopping sesame oil I stole from the grocery store. That day, I was squatting behind the shelf and watched the proprietress lock the oil bottle into a glass cabinet. A faded infant spirits go away sticker was stuck on the bottle. Lydia Sue turned to leave, and I grabbed her wrist. When your man left, he said to see the sea. Was he lying to me? Her shoulders trembled, and she didn't look back. You remembered it wrongly. My husband went to Surabaya to work last month. I let go of my hand. Her wrist was as thin as a reed, and the place where I grabbed it did not turn red, but instead turned bluish-gray. The walk back to the room felt like walking on cotton. I threw my backpack onto the bed, and my recorder, camera, and notebook all fell out. The red light on the recorder was still on, so I pressed the play button. Amid the crackling sound of electricity, the sound of a baby crying suddenly broke out. My hand shook and the recorder fell to the ground. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving only a monotonous buzzing sound. Scroll through the camera roll. The reefs, claw marks, and egg-shaped objects in the tideless area that I took 3 days ago are all gone. There is only a blurry, noisy picture, and you can barely make out that it is the hotel's desk lamp. I opened my notebook and saw the words in pen dancing on the pages. Yesterday they were filled with notes like the distance between the 5 toe paw prints is 12 centimeters, and the mucus turns blue when heated, but now they are all blank. In the lower right corner of the last page, there is an extra line of crooked handwriting. You can't hear it anymore, but it can still hear you. I rushed into the yard with the notebook in my hand. The old lady was still wiping the table. Lydia Sue was drying the fishing net, and several children ran by chasing the dog. I shouted at the top of my voice, "You all know, sea babies eat living people, and you are using fishermen as sacrifices." The eggs exploded, but it didn't die. Its mucus is in the seawater. The voice was suddenly cut off. Everyone stopped. The old lady's coconut shell fell to the ground with a pop. Lydia Sue's fishing net slid into the mud, and the child's laughter got stuck in his throat. Elliot. Village Chief Adianto walked out of the alley with new gauze wrapped around his wrist. 3 days ago, I saw a dark purple claw mark on his wrist. He stared at me, his eyes like 2 pieces of ice-hardened stone. You want to write us into the newspaper as monsters? Then you are the monster. He turned and walked into the fog. The fog suddenly became thicker, as if someone had pulled a piece of grey cloth and wrapped around his back in the blink of an eye. I took 2 steps forward and was tripped by something. I looked down and saw Nora's blue cloth skirt, lying wet on the ground with half a 5-toed claw mark on the corner of the skirt. Someone knocked on the window late at night. I got up in the dark and saw a white shadow standing on the windowsill. The moonlight leaked in, illuminating Nora's face. She was wearing a white nightgown. Her ankles were covered in mud, and there was water weed stuck in the cracks between her fingernails. You didn't kill it, you just starved it. Her voice was like wet cotton wool. Ivan. Who? She stuffed the note into my hand and turned away. I turned on the light of my phone and saw 2 crooked words written on the note, Ivan Prasetio. The first missing fisherman's body was found on a rocky beach with a row of 5-toed claw marks on his chest. I saw his shadow in the tideless zone, floating next to the egg-shaped object, his mouth opening and closing. You have been here a long time ago. I went to Ivan's house before daybreak. The wooden door of the old house had a rusty lock on it. I kicked it open and went in. The musty smell was so choking that I couldn't open my eyes. There was a photo on the table in the main room, and I picked it up. It was a photo of me and my mother at the beach in Jakarta when I was 10 years old. The corners of the photo were curled, and June 1998 was written on the back. No, I was 10 years old in 2003. I flipped through the photos. In the background, in the mist behind the waves, floated a translucent claw, with 5 hooked toes resting on the mother's shoulder. Suddenly, I heard a baby crying behind me. I turned around suddenly. The window was wide open, and the wind blew in, blowing the photos to the ground. The crying sound was getting closer and closer, like someone walking along the wall with a whistle in his mouth. I bent down to pick up the photo, and caught a glimpse of a white shadow under the bed. Nora's nightgown, with claw marks on the hem still dripping with water. Omar's voice came from outside the door. I looked up and saw him leaning against the door frame, holding a string of copper bells in his hand. In the morning light, the wrinkles around his eyes looked like they were carved by a knife. Norman Poe is awake. My throat tightened. Norman Poe is the oldest fortune teller in the village. On the first day I arrived, Sulia said that she had slept for 3 years. Omar pressed the bell into my hand. She wants to see you. The copper bell felt hot in my palm, like a piece of red-hot iron. The fog outside the door grew thicker, stretching the shadow of the old banyan tree very long, like the traces of someone crawling on the ground. Omar's bell hurt my palm. I followed him through the foggy alley. The bluish stone slabs beneath my feet shone with a cold glow, as if they were immersed in seawater. Norman's house was at the end of the village. The door curtain was made of faded red cloth, which raised a cloud of incense ash when it was lifted. The old lady curled up on a bamboo bed, with blackened scriptures piled behind her. I had never heard of the words she was muttering, which sounded like the friction of shells on rocks. "Speak." She suddenly stopped, her cloudy eyes staring at me. I dumped out Nora's note, the photos of Ivan's house, and the eggs in the moisture-free zone. When she said Ivan said I had been here a long time ago, her hand, like a dry tree branch, suddenly grabbed my wrist, and her nails almost dug into the bone. "You thought you escaped." Her voice was like a leaky bellows. Before I could react, she dipped her other hand in water and drew a symbol on my forehead. The water started to feel hot as soon as it touched my skin. I tried to hide, but her hands felt heavy, like a stone. When she let go, I saw a burnt mark on my forehead in the mirror, like a thread that had been burned by fire. On the way back to the hotel, the fog was thicker than in the morning. I pushed the door open in the dark and saw the mug on the bedside table, leaning on the edge of the table. I had clearly put it neatly in place before leaving. "Hallucination," I said to myself, and turned to draw the curtains. Suddenly a white shadow flashed in the mirror. I turned my head sharply, and there was nothing on the windowsill. I looked in the mirror again. Ivan Prasetyo was standing behind me, his wet fishing pants dripping with water, and the claw marks on his chest still oozing blood. Fuck. I picked up my phone to take a picture, and there was only myself and the camera. I put down the phone. Ivan was still there in the mirror, raising his hand and cracking his knuckles. I rushed into the bathroom to wash my face. When I came out, my chair had been moved half a foot, and the interview notes in the drawer were scattered all over the floor. I squatted down to pick it up and caught a glimpse of a white ball under the bed. Nora's nightgown, with claw marks glowing blue in the moonlight. At 3 in the morning, I took out my recorder. The cry of hying that I had recorded before was still there, so I pressed the play button. First, there was the sharp cry of a baby, and then my afternoon voice mixed in. "Omar, how did that photo end up at Ivan's house? I feel cold all over." I pressed play again, and this time it was what I had said to the mirror 10 minutes ago. I can't hold on any longer. The time displayed on the recorder screen is now. Someone knocks on the door. Lydia Sue stood at the door. Her hair was covered with mist, and her eyes were blue like bruises. She squeezed in, locked the door behind her, and spread her palms upwards. 5 claw marks were engraved in the flesh, with purple edges. "We didn't volunteer." Her voice trembled, but those who refused sank to the bottom of the tideless zone. I stared at her hands. "You are the ones crying. proof of being alive. She interrupted me. If it wants us to shout, we have to shout. If we shout like it, it will keep us here for another day. She turned to go, and I grabbed her arm. Her skin was as cold as a freshly caught fish, and it hurt my wrist bones. Lydia Sue, don't chase me. She gently pulled her hand back. Footprints in the fog can only be walked once. When the door closed, I saw a trail of wet footprints on the ground leading straight to the window. I opened the window, and there was nothing in the fog, only the sound of the sea breeze wrapped in faint sobs, which sounded very much like Lydia Sue's voice. Late in the night, I dug out the high-frequency soundwave device I brought from Jakarta. This thing is supposed to be dog-proof, but now I'm adjusting it in front of a mirror to see if I can disrupt the illusion. The me in the mirror suddenly smiled. It was not a normal smile, but a smile with the corners of the mouth stretched to the ears and the eyes narrowed into slits. I didn't move, but the person in the mirror raised his hand and tapped the glass with his knuckles. Are you still struggling? I took a half step back, and the mirror cracked with a snap. The fragments are all of me, some holding the microphone at a press conference in Jakarta, some tugging at my mother's clothes on the beach when I was 10 years old, and some squatting in front of the egg-shaped object in the tideless area, reaching out to touch the translucent membrane. You have been here for a long time. The I in all the fragments spoke at the same time. I knocked over the chair and stepped back, with my lower back pressed against the desk. The photo of Ivan's family slid out of the drawer, and the claw marks on the back glowed in the moonlight. At 5 in the morning, I stuffed all the photos, recorders, and interview notes into an envelope. The moment the seal was stuck, my own voice rang in my ears, as light as mist. Once you send it out, you really can't go back. I squeezed the envelope until my knuckles turned white. The fog outside the window had not yet dissipated, and the sound of the waves of the Banda Sea came through the fog, mixed with the faint cry of a baby. This time, it seemed to be my own voice. The desk lights at 5 in the morning were particularly dazzling in the fishing village. I stuffed the recorder the sketch Omar gave me, and the photo of the claw mark on Sulia's hand, into a leather envelope, and the sealing tape made a crackling sound on my fingertips. The corner of the envelope rubbed against my palm lines, like a piece of red-hot iron. This was my 7th day in Tanjung Village. The investigative reporter who had originally planned to solve the case within 72 hours had now become a deserter, trembling with fear as he held the evidence. The phone vibrated on the corner of the table. It was a colleague from the Jakarta office. A message popped up. Headquarters is urging us to submit a manuscript. Is there any progress in the missing case? I stared at the screen, and my Adam's apple moved. Progress? I have recordings of villagers being manipulated by Hying, photos of claw marks, and testimony from Lydia Sue that those who refuse sink to the tideless zone. But if I send these back, who would believe them? The fog in the late night seeped in through the window. I shivered and stuffed the envelope into my computer bag. Tomorrow morning, I will take the earliest fishing boat to Banda Harbor and send it out via a public mailbox. The computer suddenly made a beeping sound. I opened the draft box of my email, and my scalp instantly exploded. The 5,000-word investigation report I had written last night had now turned into a blank document. Move the mouse to the hard disk icon, and the formatted prompt will pop up in the right-click menu. Fuck. I picked up my laptop and threw it against the wall. The moment the plastic shell cracked, Lydia Sue's voice seeped out from the fragments, like a tape soaked in water. Do you think they want to know? I squatted down to pick up the fragments, and my fingertips were cut by the sharp plastic and bled. Drops of blood dripped onto the floor, mixed with mist and spread out like a deformed flower. When Sulia said proof of life, my wrist bone hurt. When Omar stuffed the sketch into my hand, there was fishy mud in the cracks of my fingernails. Nora found the diary of her brother's last voyage, and the title page read, "Don't respond on foggy nights." It turned out that they knew it long ago. Hying is not a monster. It is their fear that feeds it, and their silence that feeds it. Just like when a child is afraid of the dark, he will imagine the shadow as a ghost, and the more he fears the ghost, the more real it seems. The people of Tanjong village are afraid of the sea creature, and the more they believe in the sea creature, the more alive it seems. At daybreak, I knocked on Omar's wooden door. The old man opened the door, the copper bell still hanging on his waist, and the mist from last night still clung to his beard. I took off the bell and placed it in his palm. "I don't belong here." He pinched the copper bell until his knuckles turned white. "You've heard it," he said, "the sound like sandpaper on a rock. It will follow you until you become part of it." I turned to leave, and he added behind me, "That lullaby, the one your mother sang, can calm it down." The night before departure, I sat on the rocky beach. The fog of the Banda Sea rolled in, bringing with it a familiar cry. This time it was not a baby, not a mother, but the 10-year-old me, squatting on the beach in Jakarta calling Mom. I closed my eyes and hummed, "Go to sleep, my baby. The waves will rock you gently." The crying paused, like a thread being cut. When I opened my eyes again, the fog had dissipated. The moon hung overhead, illuminating the rocks with a snow-white glow. Even the sound of the tide washing over one's feet was clear enough to be heard. On the day of leaving, the fishing boat rumbled out of the harbor. I watched Tanjong village blur into the mist, like a crumpled piece of cloth. My phone vibrated in my pocket, so I took it out and dragged all the recordings, photos, and notes into the recycle bin. With a ding sound, the deletion is completed. When the boat reached the middle of the sea, I heard some movement behind me. Looking back, thick fog was coming from all directions, thicker than last night, like a wall. The captain called to me, "Mr. Quinn, come and help collect the nets." I responded, and when I turned around, I caught a glimpse of a shadow in the fog. It looked like a person, but not quite. But this time, I didn't look back. The waves at the stern had not yet dissipated when the fog came in. "Mr. Quinn," the captain's voice trembled. "The compass is spinning like crazy." I grabbed the railing and moved closer. The brass pointer spun around in the wooden box, like a spinning top with its soul sucked out of it. The phone screen was covered with snow, and even the maritime satellite signal was gone. The engine was roaring underneath the boat, but the horizon was always that grey fog. We hadn't moved a damn thing. Try high-frequency white noise. I took out my recorder. This is what I learned when I was investigating an illegal laboratory in Jakarta. Certain sound waves can interfere with the sensory systems of living things. I pressed play, and a sharp buzzing sound tore through the mist, and for 2 seconds, I could see the blue water surging beside the boat. But those 2 seconds were too short. As the fog closed in again, Ivan's voice seeped out from it. He is Nora's brother, the first fisherman to disappear 3 months ago. I have seen his photo in the village history museum, a tanned face and a scar on his left eyebrow. At this moment his voice was like cotton soaked in water. "You shouldn't leave." The captain's face turned white as salt. Turn it off now." I didn't close it. The recorder was burning against my palm. Ivan's voice began to overlap, from 1 to 10, from 10 to 100, all saying the same thing: "You shouldn't have left." There is a backup satellite phone in the cabin. I clutched the recorder and crawled down. The musty smell mixed with the fishy smell hitting my nostrils. There was a pile of half-wet fishing nets in the corner, and the bucket had fallen over, with water forming a small puddle on the wooden board. When I bent down, I caught a glimpse of a face reflected in the water. It was me, but when my right hand was halfway raised, the me in the water slowly raised my left hand. A beat slower. I froze in place. The reflection's left index finger hooked and pointed behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around suddenly and saw a person standing in the shadow at the stern. It was Ivan. The scar on his left eyebrow was still there, but his eyes were empty, like 2 fish bladders that had been dug out. His mouth moved, but this time he didn't say anything, just smiled. Exactly the same smile he had in the photo in the Village History Museum, when he was holding the freshly caught tuna. Shit. I stumbled back, banging my knee on the bucket. There was a sound of splashing water, and the reflection was shattered into pieces. When he looked up again, Ivan's shadow had disappeared. There was a sudden sharp pain in my forehead. I touched it, and the marks Norman had made with palm ash were still there, like a piece of red-hot charcoal stuck to my skin. Before she left, she grabbed my wrist and chanted a spell. I thought it was just a trick, but now those syllables suddenly turned in my mind. Taran, Kaya, Tyre. When I said the first word, the whole ship shook. Cries came from all directions. It's not a baby, nor is it a mother, but countless me. The 10-year-old me, who called for my mother on the beach. The 20-year-old me, who was holding my mother's medical records in the hospital, and the me who was humming a lullaby on the rocky beach 3 days ago. They stacked together, like a rusty knife scraping the eardrum. Ivan's shadow emerged from the fog. This time his body was twisting, and purple veins were bulging under his skin, as if something was about to burst his flesh. "Don't wake it," he screamed, his voice breaking into pieces. "Do you think you can escape the tideless zone? You think..." Before he could finish his words, he was swallowed by the fog. The fog got thicker in the second half of the night. I was sitting on the deck wrapped in a life jacket, and my recorder had long run out of battery. The wind carried a salty smell of water, and I heard footsteps very slow and very wet, like someone stepping on water-soaked cotton shoes. "Mr. Quinn." I looked up. Nora appeared at the railing, water dripping from the ends of her hair, and a trail of watermarks on the wooden planks beneath her feet. Her missing brother was her life. I had seen her fingertips tremble as she turned the pages of her diary, and I had seen her hold her brother's old fishing hat in her arms. At this moment her eyes were dead, like two white fish turned upside down. "You can't escape." Her voice was like bubbles rising from the bottom of the sea. "We are all part of it." I rushed over and grabbed her wrist. The skin that my fingertips touched was as cold as ice, but it disappeared the next second, like a ball of mist blown away by the wind. There was an extra photo in my hand. It was a photo of the pier that I took on the day I left, with a faded wooden sign, a rusty anchor, and a blurry figure standing in the corner of the photo. That's me, wearing today's blue shirt, holding a laptop, looking at the camera and smiling. But I clearly remember that I was the only one holding the phone when the photo was taken, and there was no one behind me. Cold sweat ran down my spine. I finally understood what Omar meant by "be part of it." The tide-free zone is not a geographical concept at all, but a web woven by Haiying with his memory. I thought leaving the village was an escape, but in fact, from the moment I heard the first cry, I was trapped in this web. Those real memories, Salia's recordings, Omar's sketches, Nora's journals were all bait it had created. Now it's tired of illusions. The boat suddenly shook. I stood up holding the railing, and the roar of an engine came from the fog, exactly the same as our ship. The captain rushed out of the cockpit, his face as white as paper. The radar shows. His voice was drowned out by the crying. This time it was my own voice, whispering into my ear, "Come with me to see the sea." I leaned against the bulkhead and closed my eyes. When I opened my eyes again, the light above my head flickered and there was a strange smell of diesel in the air. The paint on the bulkhead peeled off, revealing dark red marks underneath, like blood. The crying outside the boat continued, and I don't even remember when I fell asleep. I was woken by the smell of diesel. My throat felt like it was stuffed with a rag soaked in seawater, and the ceiling was shaking when I opened my eyes. The cabin was very small, and the iron walls shone with a cold light. I reached out and touched it, and my fingertips felt something sticky. I leaned in to smell it, and it was rust mixed with the sweet fishy smell of fish gills. There are photos on the wall, more than 20 sheets pinned together in a ring, with rusty thumbtacks. I recognized those scenes, the pier of Tanjong village, The broken anchor on the rocky beach, the faded copper bell in Omar's house, and even one photo I took while squatting at the door of the village office. At that time, Sulia was stuffing paper money into the merit box, and the corner of her clothes was lifted by the wind. There were crooked symbols painted on the edges of each photo. I stared at it for 3 seconds, and my back teeth suddenly felt sore. That was the sacrificial text drawn on the beach by the witch Norman when she performed a ritual. I had photographed her carving these symbols out of shells, saying that they were to calm the mouth of the sea baby. There is a notebook on the bedside. The cover is the leather one I brought from Jakarta, and the edges are polished to a shine. I opened the first page and found my handwriting, but the content was so unfamiliar that it seemed like someone else had written it. The heartbeat of the sea is 3 long and 2 short, the same rhythm as when my mother pats my back. The second page. Sulia's cry is more pleasant than that of the sea baby. She begged me not to investigate, saying that if I continued to investigate, I would become part of the sea. The third page. When Omar gave me the sketch today, there was mucus in the cracks of his fingernails, the same as the claw marks on the reef beach. I clenched my pen tightly, wanting to record the chaos at the moment. As soon as the pen tip touched the paper, my wrist suddenly went numb. The 3 words, "Who am I?" were just half written when the ink, like sand blown away by the wind, twisted and turned into "Who is it?" The pen fell to the ground with a clang. I stared at the line of words, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Hying was imitating my handwriting, using my obsession with facts as a knife to stab into my brain. There were footsteps outside the cabin, very light, like someone stepping barefoot on the water film. "Stop writing," a voice came from behind, with the sound of sea breeze. I turned around and Ivan Persetiu was standing in the doorway. The blue striped shirt he was wearing on the day he disappeared was still dripping with water, and the scar on his left eyebrow was blue, left by a fight between him and fishermen from a neighboring village last month. "You think you're fighting it, but you're actually feeding it," he said. His voice was no longer as cold as before, but rather like an old tape soaked in warm water. "Fear is the best food. The more you struggle, the faster it grows." I tried to speak, but something blocked my throat. Clifton raised his hand and tapped the porthole with his knuckles. A shadow emerged from the thick fog, like a crumpled cloth. It was the church spire of Tanjong village. The faded cross flickered in the fog, as if I had never left. "They're all waiting for you," he said, "waiting for you to become part of them." When he disappeared, there was a letter at the bedside. The envelope was made of craft paper sold at the Tanjong village store, and there was half a shell stuck to the seal. The moment I opened it, I almost crushed the letter. The handwriting was Lydia Sue's, and the last stroke of each "Lee" was pointed upwards, exactly the same as the stitches on the sweater she knitted for her missing husband. "We are not monsters. We just choose the way to survive. If you want to escape, the only way is to become a part of it, and then tear it apart." The last line of words was blurred by water, like ink dripping on rice paper. Noman's soul-breaking ceremony. The crying sound outside the cabin started again. This time it was not a baby crying, nor was it the mother's voice, but Lydia Sue's with the softness she used when coaxing her daughter, "Come with me to see the sea." I closed my eyes. The crying sound flooded into my ears like the rising tide. I remembered Omar said that the sea baby's web is woven with memories, so I will use memory as a knife. My mother's lullaby in Javanese was playing in my mind. "The moon is asleep, be good baby." The laughter of my childhood best friend, who always snatched my coffee when I was writing, and the night I first heard Hyang cry, Sulia knocked on my door to bring me ginger tea with fish scales on her apron. These fragments collided in my mind, and suddenly something pierced me. Countless faces, Omar, Nora, Ivan, Sulia, and myself. The mouths of each face were moving, saying the same words. Night watchman, ring the bell, close the windows and doors." I opened my eyes suddenly. There was a face pressed against the porthole. It was my own. The eyes glowed with a light blue light, like jellyfish in the deep sea. He smiled, his lips moving. "You finally saw us." The ship suddenly shook violently. I held onto the table and glimpsed that there was an extra line of words on the last page of my notebook. It was written in my trembling handwriting. "The night watchman ceremony is not to calm the sea baby, but to feed it. All the missing people eventually become souls in the bronze bell." The cries became the tinkling of bells, the same sound that Omar rang every night. I reached into my pocket and found a crumpled piece of paper. It was the sketch Omar had given me. The lines of the reef monster's claws were blurred by the water, and it looked like a hand with 5 fingers spread out, and the palm engraved with Norman's sacrificial symbol. The hatch creaked open. The wind blew the fog in, and I smelled the scent of Tanjung village, the salty and humid sea fog mixed with the aroma of dried fish drying on the rocks. "It's time to go back," I said to the air. The notebook automatically turned to a new page, and I didn't stop it this time. The pen tip moved by itself and wrote, "Norman's soul-breaking ceremony requires the blood of the night watchman and the tears of the sea infant." The ship's whistle suddenly sounded. I grabbed the sketch and the letter and ran to the deck. The Tanjong village in the fog became clearer and clearer. On the cross on the church spire, there was a black bird tilting its head to look at me. Its eyes were blue, the same blue as the eyes of the face in the porthole. I touched the pen in my pocket. The cap was covered with mucus, like the skin of a sea baby. "It's time to go back," I whispered to the village in the thick fog. The sound of copper bells rang softly in the wind, mixed with a vague response, "Welcome home." I rushed into Tanjong village at low tide. The rocky beach hurt my feet, and the sketches and notebooks in my arms were soaked by the fog. The blackbird on the church spire fluttered away, but I stared at the remaining blue spots on the cross, the same color as the eyes of the face in the porthole. Norman's house is at the end of the village, with faded coconut shell wind chimes hanging on the bamboo door. When I knocked on the door, it opened a crack by itself. The witch was sitting on a straw mat with 3 kerosene lamps in front of her, and the wicks were emitting a faint blue flame. "You want a soul-breaking ceremony." Her voice was like sandpaper scraping coral. "To peel off the sea baby's net, you have to use memory as bait." I slapped the sketch at her feet. "The paw print drawn by Omar's son overlaps with your sacrificial symbol. The night watchman does not suppress it, but feeds it." A kerosene lamp went out with a puff. Norman's fingers traced across the sketch paper, and there was dark red between her nails. I couldn't tell if it was cinnabar or blood. "Once you start, there's no going back," she said. "Are you sure you want to be the one that gets erased?" I took out the pen from my pocket. The sticky liquid on the cap was still wet. "Sure." The ceremony began before the moon set. Norman asked me to take off my shoes and walk barefoot on the ground strewn with broken shells. She put something wet on my forehead, and a fishy smell went straight into my nose. Later I guessed it was Hying's tears mixed with her blood. "Close your eyes." She said something I couldn't understand, and her voice suddenly became very soft. "It will drag your memory to dance one last dance." As darkness came over me, I heard the voice of Hying. It wasn't crying, but countless fine needles piercing my nerves, each needle carrying a memory. My mother's lullaby torn into pieces, the fish scales on Sulia's apron glowing, and the calluses on Omar's knuckles rubbing against the back of my hand when he was sketching. Then I saw the core. It was a translucent egg, wrapped in a slimy membrane, with countless faces floating inside. Ivan, Sulia, Omar's son, and myself. Every mouth was moving, but no sound came out. I took a step forward. The egg's surface cracked, as if someone was knocking on glass inside. "I'm not your enemy," I said to the eggs, my throat tight. "I just want to go home." The moment the fingertips touched the eggs, all faces turned. Their mouths opened wide, and their cries exploded into their ears, as if someone had smashed their skulls with a hammer. I stumbled to my knees, only to find myself humming my mother's lullaby, in Javanese, very out of tune. "The moon is asleep, baby." Be good. The faces suddenly became quiet. The egg membrane began to peel off, revealing the turbid liquid inside. I saw countless silver threads coming out of the liquid, wrapping around my wrists and ankles, and finally sinking into the back of my neck. But what was clearer than the pain was that something was peeling away. It was as if someone had used a spoon to dig out my brain, and the empty space was filled with sea breeze, which was salty and had a fishy smell. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on a wooden bed in the hotel. The sun shone through the blinds, making the sheets smell like laundry detergent. My phone was vibrating next to my pillow, so I picked it up to check Dax. The album was empty. All the photos of Tanjung Village were gone. The recording file only had crackling noises. There was a video, but when I opened it, the screen was covered with snow, and I could faintly hear the sound of a bell, which soon disappeared. I threw back the quilt and got out of bed, and paused the moment the soles of my feet touched the floor. My shoes were lying on the edge of the bed, with half a broken shell stuck in the sole, exactly the same as the one on the floor in Norman's room. Some truths cannot be seen, I said to the mirror. The person in the mirror blinked, and his eyes were unfamiliar, as if he was looking at someone else. Omar was ringing the copper bell under the old banyan tree at the entrance of the village. When I walked over, his hand stopped in midair, and the lingering sound of the copper bell was still swirling in the air. I'll give it back to you. I handed the bell over. There was a thin layer of frost on the bell's surface, and it felt cold to the touch. The old man didn't answer. He just stared into my eyes. His pupils reflected me, the shadow of the banyan tree, and the distant horizon covered by fog. You've come back, he said, his voice hoarse than in his memory, but you've also stayed forever. I loosened my grip, and the bell fell into his arms. When I turned around, my back felt a little itchy, as if something was crawling under my skin. Later, I thought it was probably the scars left by the silver lines. On the plane back to Jakarta, I found the notepad in the compartment of my wallet. There was a line of blurred handwriting on it, as if it had been soaked in water and then dried. Nerman's soul-breaking ceremony requires the blood of the night watch and the tears of the sea infant. I tore up the note. The next time I saw thick fog was during an overtime night. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the only lamp on my desk was on in the office. The coffee had long gone cold. The computer screen was glowing coldly, and the title of the report that had just been written was Investigation into the Missing Cargo Case at Jakarta Port. Suddenly, there was a cry outside the window. It wasn't a car horn or a baby screaming, but a wet cry wrapped in fog, like someone crying with their face pressed against the glass. I looked up and saw a layer of frost-like fog on the glass, and a blurry palm print with 5 fingers spread wide apart. My heart was beating so fast it was about to burst my ribs. I grabbed the mug and slowly put it down. A melody emerged from my throat. I don't even know when I learned it. The moon is asleep, baby. Be good. The fog began to recede. The palm prints faded. The crying became weaker. And finally only the hum of wind blowing through the air conditioner outdoor unit remained. I touched the back of my neck, and there was a coin-sized scar that felt like fish scales. What happened next was ordinary. I continued to cover the news, occasionally went to the pier to take photos, and ate gado-gado on the street. I've just been dreaming a lot lately. On the first night, I stood on the rocky beach, and a figure waved at me in the fog. On the second night, the face of the figure gradually became clear, and it was me. On the third night, I followed the shadows into the sea. When the water reached my ankles, I heard someone whisper in my ear, "Come with me to see the sea." I woke up suddenly, my pillow soaked with cold sweat. The moon outside the window was very round, like a peeled egg. On the third night after returning to Jakarta, I saw Nora for the first time in my dream. She stood at the edge of the damp-free zone, the mist rising to her calves. I wanted to call her name, but my throat felt like it was clogged with wet cotton. When she turned around, I saw clearly that she was holding a baby in her arms. That was her missing daughter. When I interviewed her 3 months ago, she always hung her daughter's silver locket around her neck. "You promised to take us back," she said. When I woke up, my phone screen was lit on the bedside table. There is a new photo in the album, Tanjong Village Pier. There is a man standing in the fog. His back looks very much like me. I looked through the shooting records and the time showed it was 2:17 last night. At that time I was clutching the bed sheets that were soaked with cold sweat. In the fourth night's dream, Nora's face became clearer. The swaddling clothes in her arms moved, and the sound of crying seeped out from under the cloth. "You promised," she repeated, and the swaddling clothes suddenly split open, revealing half of a blue-gray hand with nails like fish hooks. On the fifth night, I followed her into the sea. When the sea water reached her knees, she suddenly smiled. "Look, he is waiting for you." I looked down and saw that the face reflected in the water was not my face, but the man in the photo. Add one more photo to your phone album every day. On the morning of the seventh day, I stared at the latest photo, a man standing under Omar's old banyan tree, holding a copper bell in his hand. I touched the fish scale scar on the back of my neck, and the skin on the scar felt hot. The editor-in-chief called on the 8th day. "Someone sent me a tape," he said. "Listen to it." The tape first heard the sound of electricity, and then the sound of me in Tanjong Village. On the first night, I heard a baby crying outside the window. On the second night, I said to myself in the mirror, "Some truths cannot be seen." On the third night, I muttered to myself while squatting on the rocky beach counting paw prints. I even made a video call to my mother in the hotel and said, "I will bring you pearls from the Banda Sea when I go back." "Who sent it?" I asked. "Anonymous. But the mailing address is Tanjong Village." The editor paused. "Also, there is a blank in the tape. About 3:17 in the morning. What were you doing at that time?" I squeezed my phone. At 3:17 in the morning of that day, I was standing in front of the hotel window, humming a lullaby that I had learned from somewhere into the thick fog. I dialed the sender's number. It rang 3 times, and a man answered with a voice like sandpaper on iron. "Elliot Quinn." "Who are you?" "Ardianto," he said. "Village chief." I froze in place. Ardianto, the village chief of Tanjung Village, glared at me at the entrance of the village when I left 3 months ago, and said, "Outsiders should not come back." "You're not gone yet," he said. "It's still in you." The phone was hung up. I stared at the screen of my phone, which showed that the call lasted 17 seconds, the exact same time as the first photo in the album was taken. I bought the earliest boat ticket to Ambon Island. Before I left, I put the tape in the office safe and set the combination to Nora's daughter's birthday. Tanjong Village is quieter than I remember. There were no fishing nets hanging on the dock. The bamboo plates used to dry fish were lying upside down, and there was not even the sound of a dog barking. As I passed the grocery store, the glass door suddenly opened, and Marta stood in the shadows, holding a ceramic vase in her hand. Crying oil. She thrust the bottle at me, digging her nails into the back of my hand. "They're starting to prepare it again." "Who?" "Sea infant." She looked down at her feet. "And the night watchman." I wanted to ask Omar, but Marta had retreated back into the shop, and when the door curtain fell, I caught a glimpse of half a dozen of the same ceramic vases piled at her feet. Omar's old house was locked, but some of the moss on the windowsill had been rubbed off. Someone had been in recently. I climbed in from the backyard and saw copper bells piled in the corner, each covered with a thin layer of frost. I moved the top one and found a diary underneath, covered with sailcloth. The first page reads, "Duties of the night watchman. On the 15th of every month, select 3 families with babies and take them to a tide-free area." Page 2. Hyene feeds on fear, resentment, and promises. It does not imitate the sound, but the softest part of the human heart. The handwriting on the last page was crooked, as if it was written with a shaking hand. If the soul-severing ceremony fails, it will return through your voice. I heard it speak in the bell saying, he promised to take us back. When I closed the diary, the bell suddenly rang by itself. Ding dong, like someone tapping with their knuckles. The hotel room late at night is like an ice cellar. I stuffed the diary under my pillow, and the scented oil in the ceramic bottle smelled of bitter almonds. The fog outside the window began to spread, first blurring the window frame, then crawling over the desk and wetting the tips of my shoes. The sound of a baby crying came from the ceiling. This time, I didn't hum a lullaby. I followed the sound and touched the mildew on the ceiling with my fingers. What do you want to tell me? The crying stopped. There were footsteps outside the window, very slow, like bare feet stepping on wet rocks. Elliot. It was Ivan's voice. He disappeared 3 months ago, and when his body was found, there were reef debris between his fingernails. We're still waiting for you. I rushed to the window and saw only a shadow in the fog. It had its back to me, wearing the dark grey coat that I often wore in Jakarta, and had a coin-sized scar on the back of its neck, exactly the same position as on the back of my neck. It was 3:17 in the morning, and I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, shaving. When the blade touched my chin, the mirror suddenly fogged up. A face emerged from the mist. It was the man in the photo album. His lips moved, and I heard my own voice seeping out of the mirror. Come with me to see the sea. The razor fell to the ground with a bang. I stared at the mirror. The mist was flowing down the surface and forming small puddles on the countertop. There was something moving in the puddle, like a small translucent fish with a little blood on its tail, the same color as the blood oozing from the fish scale scar on the back of my neck. The sound of the razor falling on the tile was still buzzing in my ears. I bent down to pick it up, and when my knuckles brushed against the mirror-like puddle, the translucent little fish suddenly darted into the drain, and its tail swept across the back of my hand, piercing it like an ice needle. The fog in the mirror dissipated completely. I straightened up and saw that my reflection was pursing my lips. I hadn't moved my lips just now. Elliot. This time the voice came from behind. I turned around suddenly. The vines on the windowsill were swaying in the night wind, and a shadow was stuck in the gap. The outline was too familiar. A faded blue shirt, trouser legs rolled up to the ankles, and a patch on the left little toe. It was Ivan, the fisherman who was found on the rocky beach 3 months ago, his body full of rock debris between his fingernails. His eyes were like 2 balls of cotton soaked in seawater, staring at me blankly. I rushed over to open the window, but the vines suddenly wrapped around my wrists, as slippery as swollen seaweed. When I shook off the vines, the shadow was gone, leaving only half a sentence floating in the mist. When the moon is full. At 4 in the morning, I sat up in my bed wrapped in a blanket, with Omar's diary under my pillow, my back aching. Turning to the last page, the words, "If the soul-severing ceremony fails, it will return through your voice," were stained with water, like a ball of mold that would not melt away. As soon as the sky brightened, I went to the village primary school. The principal was an old man wearing round-framed glasses, squatting in the playground to repair the basketball hoop. You asked about the legend of Hyang. He wiped the sweat off his face with his sleeve. Teacher Sulia just told the children about it last week. She is best at these folk tales. Leah Su. I clutched my notebook. When I was sorting out the missing persons list 3 days ago, I had clearly seen this name in the accidental drowning column. When the body was washed up on the beach, the fishing net was still wrapped around its wrists. The classroom door opened. The woman in the blue cloth skirt was bending over, wiping the tears of the little girl who had fallen and was crying. When she looked up, I saw translucent mucus condensed in the cracks of her fingernails, which glowed light blue in the morning light, exactly the same as the claw mark mucus on the corpse on the reef beach. "Mr. Elliot," she laughed, "want to hear the story of the sea infant? They are the best at imitating the cries of babies." My throat tightened, and I retreated to the corridor, making the excuse that I wanted to take a picture of the classroom. The phone contained a photo of Lydia Sue's death certificate. The date of death was 2 months ago. In the photo of the body, her fingernails were all turned up, and she looked like a completely different person from her clean hands now. On the way back to the hotel, the curtain of Marta's grocery store was suddenly lifted. She flashed out and stuffed a cloth bag into my hand, her fingers as cold as ice, mugwort and cinnabar put under the pillow. The note. She pointed to the interlayer of the cloth bag and glanced around. The moon is full tonight, and they are going to choose a new substitute. Who chooses? I grabbed her wrist, but she shrunk back like a slippery fish. No one knows who started it, but we can't stop. She walked backwards into the store, the door curtain covering her face, and added, "The scar on the back of your neck is exactly the same as the one Ivan had before he disappeared." The crumpled note in the cloth bag read in pencil, "The fog in the tide-free zone will eat away people's memories, including your own." I rushed into Norman's cabin with the note in my hand. The witch was squatting by the fire, cooking medicine. Her face flickered in the steam. "Do you think those missing people were dragged away by Hyang?" She poked the fire with a stick. "They left voluntarily. Hyang gave them what they wanted, the voice of a mother, the smile of a child, or," she suddenly looked up, "the voice of the mother who died in Jakarta." I froze in place. The scene of my mother's funeral 3 months ago suddenly came to my mind, the rain hitting the coffin, and I said to the tombstone, "When I find the truth, I will come to accompany you." "You think you're here to investigate?" Norman put her hand on my forehead, and black marks crawled out from her fingertips like a burning centipede. "You're just a replica that looks more like a human. What Hyang wants is not life, but a shell that can speak." A sharp pain exploded from my temple. I stumbled and knocked over the medicine jar, and the brown liquid splashed onto the ground, revealing what was underneath, a ceramic bottle similar to the one in Marta's shop, with the mouth of the bottle sealed with wax, and I could vaguely see a hairy thing soaking inside. "The moon is full tonight." Norman's voice mixed with the smell of medicine penetrated into her ears. "You will hear it say, 'Come with me to see the sea.' This time," she smiled, "you won't refuse." The evening fog came earlier than usual. I stood in the middle of the village square and deliberately raised my voice to recite the sacrificial incantation from Omar's diary. The tide receded 3 times. The soul has no place to return to. The sea baby eats the wish, and the sound is the root. The mist suddenly came alive and enveloped my ankles, waist, and neck. An old lady selling fish passed by with her load on her shoulder. The fish in the bamboo basket fluttered, but she acted like she didn't see me. When she passed by me, the bamboo basket hit my shoulder and it hurt. The old clock at the entrance of the village struck 7 times. I looked around at the numb villagers. They could see me, could touch me, but they couldn't see the thick fog that enveloped me. The scar on the back of my neck began to feel hot. I touched it, and my fingertips were stained with blood. The translucent little fish floated out of the puddle again, and this time there was a strand of silver hair wrapped around its tail, exactly the same hair color as in my mother's posthumous photo. As the moon rose, I walked along the rocky beach towards the tideless area. There was a shadow waiting in the fog at the beach, with his back to me. He was wearing the dark gray jacket that I often wore in Jakarta, and there was a coin-sized scar on the back of his neck. Elliot. It turned its face, and its features were exactly like mine. "Come with me to see the sea." The sound of the waves suddenly became louder. I heard my own voice mixed in the waves, floating over from a very old place. "Okay." When I followed that me to the rocky beach, the sound of the waves suddenly disappeared. The moonlight sprinkled on the tide line like broken silver, and the shadow stopped behind the deepest reef, and the back looked like a piece of melted wax. I took out the brass whistle that Omar had stuffed into my hand. The old fisherman said it was what his son was holding in his hand before he disappeared. There was still some half-dried mucus on the whistle. "Ivan," I called out. The shadow stopped. As it turned its face, its facial features began to peel off, revealing a young face underneath. It was the boy with fangs showing in the photo that Marta always hung behind the counter, Ivan Prasetio. You are not me. I took a step forward, crushing the shells at my feet. Hai Ying used my appearance to deceive me. But you are Ivan's shadow, right? Shadow dug his fingers into the rocks, and rock chips fell down. You shouldn't have come. I want the truth. I took out my notebook and slapped it on the reef. 17 disappearances occurred in 3 months. Omar's son, Marta's fiancé, and me. I pulled the burning scar on the back of my neck. You need bodies, and I need answers. In exchange, tell me what the sea baby is, and I won't destroy your fog. Shadow opened his mouth, revealing 2 rows of transparent teeth. The sea baby is not a monster. Its voice was like 2 reefs rubbing against each other. It is the pus of fear. The waves suddenly rolled in and wet my trouser legs. Shadow's words were mixed in the salty wind. Fishermen are afraid of drowned babies, afraid of undercurrents in tidal areas, and afraid of dying of old age on old fishing boats. These fears come together to form the sea baby. It devours fear and breeds fear like a turning millstone. So the missing people followed it voluntarily. I remembered Norman's words. They heard the voices they longed to hear the most. Mucus oozed from the shadow's eyes. Your mother called you to come home for dinner. Ivan heard Marta say, we'll get married when the fishing season starts. Omar's son, it suddenly grabbed its own throat. He heard his little daughter shouting, Daddy, hold me. But the child died in the tidal gully at birth. I took a half step back, and the scar on the back of my neck began to bleed. The shadow's outline became blurred again, and it was about to merge into the fog. Remember, its voice suddenly became lighter, just like the tone of Marta's voice when she handed me tea. The more specific the fear, the stronger the sea baby. When the tide receded, the ceramic bottle in my trouser pocket became hot. It was picked up from under the Nerman fire pit. The ball of fur inside was stained with the blood from my fingertips, and was slowly unfolding, taking the outline of a baby. The next day, before dawn, Norman knocked on my door. She was not wearing her usual floral shirt, but a faded black skirt, and was holding something wrapped in a banana leaf in her arms. Here, she stuffed the banana leaf in my hand, and out rolled a blue-gray shell with 5 crescent-shaped claw marks carved on the surface. This is not a curse, it's a key. I held the shell, and it felt cold to the touch. You said yesterday that I was a clone. You are a living person. She squatted down and pushed aside the scar on the back of my neck. But you are also a resonator. Every 100 years, Bandahai will choose a person to hear the heartbeat of the sea baby. The last one was my grandmother, and the one before that, she smiled, was Omar's grandfather. So that's why you said those things before? I remembered the time she poked my forehead with her red-hot finger. It stimulates you to wake up. She took out a brass bell from her skirt pocket. It was very similar to the one Omar rang every night, but the bell mouth was engraved with waves. The sea baby devours fear, and is also afraid of waking up. The clearer you are about who you are, the more vague its sound becomes. I suddenly remembered the notes I wrote last night at Rocky Beach. I opened the notebook and saw that yesterday's handwriting was crooked like a worm, but today's newly written I am Elliot Quinn, a reporter for the Jakarta Times, was extremely neat, with every letter written straight. Marta came on the afternoon of the 3rd day. She was holding a tin box, and there was sawdust between her fingernails. I knew she was helping Adianto repair the fishing boat, but she shouldn't be at my door at this time. I heard it, she said suddenly, her voice trembling. Another me said in the fog, come with me to see the sea. It was exactly the same as before Ivan disappeared. I opened the door and she followed me in, putting the tin box on the table. The plan you mentioned, using fake sacrifices to lure away the sea infant, and then burying a sonic device. She opened the lid of the box, and inside were 6 small speakers neatly placed. I ordered them from Sishui overnight. They are said to be able to emit infrasound waves to interfere with the hearing of animals. Will it hurt? She asked suddenly. If the sea baby finds out we've lied to it. I remembered what Ivan's shadow had said, and touched the shell in my pocket. It will hurt, but the pain means we are still awake. The full moon night comes faster than expected. I stood in the middle of the rocky beach, holding the copper bell given by Norman in my left hand, and a shell with claw marks engraved on it in my right hand. As the fog came over me like a ball of thick milk, wrapping around my knees, I heard. First there was the cry of a baby, like a muzzled kitten. Then there was the mother's voice, with the dampness of Jakarta's rainy season. "Elliot, it's time to go home." Then there was Ivan's laughter, Marta's humming, and finally my own voice, floating from far away. "Come with me to see the sea." I closed my eyes. The scar on the back of my neck still hurts, but it's not as hot anymore. I raised the bell and shook it gently. "I know you're here," I said to the fog. The fog suddenly cleared away. All the shadows emerged from the fog. Omar's son holding a faded rag doll, Ivan holding Marta's hand, and Adianto's old dog squatting at his feet, wagging its tail. Their outlines were no longer blurry, and their faces even had some color. "Welcome home," the shadows said in unison. I opened my eyes, and the moonlight was shining on the claw marks of the shell. Marta poked her head out from behind the reef and made an okay gesture to me. Her sonic device must have been activated. When the sound of the waves came again, I took out my notebook and wrote on the last page, "The sea baby is not an enemy, but a mirror." The writing is so clear that it looks like it was carved. In the distant fog, a shadow moved. It had its back to me, wearing a dark grey coat, and had a coin-sized scar on the back of its neck. I know it is waiting for the next full moon night, waiting for me to ask the next question. But tonight, I just clutched the shell a little tighter. I was awakened by the sound of waves in the early morning of the fourth day. The shell under the pillow was hot like a red-hot coal. I got up in the dark. There was a thin layer of mist on the windowsill, and a blurry shadow was swaying against the glass. It was Ivan. The blue striped shirt he was wearing on the day he disappeared still smelled of fish. "Want to talk?" I opened the window. The sea breeze brought in salty and humid mist, but his outline did not fade away. Instead, it became more solid. The corners of his eyes still had the same smile as when he was alive. "Aren't you afraid of me?" I was afraid. I leaned against the window frame. "But last time you said the other me is having problems, and now I have problems." His fingers gripped the windowsill, dark brown water seeping from the cracks between his nails. "Speak." "The truth about Haiying," I said bluntly. "Tell me. I won't disrupt your order." There were faint whimpers in the fog, like someone chewing broken glass. Ivan's smile faded. He looked towards the horizon, where a ball of grey fog floated that would never disperse. "It's not a monster. It's our fear gathered into a shell." When he turned back, his pupils turned into a cloudy milky white. "You said it was a mirror on the reef beach. You were half right. It reflects the fear we dare not admit. Fear of the sea, fear of death, fear of children drowning in the waves, fear of becoming a name on the missing list." His hand suddenly grabbed my wrist. His skin was as cold as an octopus just pulled out of the water. "You've already talked to it." His voice suddenly became softer, mixed with the rhythm of the tide. "It's also listening to your heartbeat." I pulled my hand back, and the shell left a red mark on my palm. The shadows outside the window began to fade. I shouted thank you, but he didn't respond. He just left a sentence, "Go ask Norman," and was swallowed by the fog. Norman's hut is at the east end of the village, with 7 strings of dried seahorses hanging in front of the door. When I pushed the door open, she was sprinkling crushed coral powder into a ceramic bowl. She looked up and saw me, and her cloudy eyes suddenly lit up. "You're here. Why didn't you stop the sacrifice?" I swallowed Ivan's words and got to the point directly. "Those missing people were not captured by Haiying at all. You used them to feed fear." She didn't respond, but reached out and touched my forehead. I wanted to hide, but her fingers like dry tree branches held me down. Sharp pain exploded from my forehead, like a red-hot needle drilling into my skull. I stumbled and knocked over a wooden bench. The ceramic bowl shattered at my feet. Half a bloody nail was mixed in with the coral powder, the same color as the one between Ivan's nails. Do you think you are the first? She bent down to pick up corals, her white hair hanging down to cover her face. 20 years ago, there was a reporter who had a scar on the back of his neck, just like you, and he loved to ask why. She suddenly looked up, the flickering candlelight reflected in her pupils. He also succeeded, until one day when he looked in the mirror. I touched the back of my neck, where the old scar was burning. What if I wasn't afraid anymore? She smiled, air leaking out from her missing front tooth mouth. Fear is not an emotion, it's the mud in your bones. The more you want to clean it out, the more it gets stuck in your flesh and blood. After that day, I started keeping anti-fear notes. Every morning at 5 o'clock, I sat on the rooftop of the hotel and forced myself to recall my mother's face, the way the steam covered her glasses when she made ginger tea, the corners of her mouth turned up when she scolded me for leaving my school bag in the rain, and the blue wool she used to knit my scarf was still stained under her fingernails when she grabbed my hand and said, "Don't be afraid of the dark," before she died. I wrote in my notebook, "I am not a victim. I am a witness." The first line of words was crooked, as if it had been soaked in water. The second line is a little straighter. When I was writing the third line, the tip of the pen suddenly stopped. The handwriting was clear and crisp, just like when I wrote my thesis in college. That evening, I tried to hum my mother's lullaby. The tune ran 8 times, but the fog outside the window dissipated quickly. Marta passed by with nasi lemak and looked up and shouted, "Elliot, I saw the lighthouse." Lighthouse! The lighthouse in Tanjong village was demolished 10 years ago. I leaned on the windowsill and saw a white house floating on the horizon, with the glass cover on the top shining. Marta's voice floated up. "The plan you mentioned, using fake sacrifices to lure away the sea baby. Can I help?" She was standing downstairs holding a plastic bag in her hand with half a piece of black wire sticking out, the same type of sonic device she gave me 3 days ago. "Why did you change your mind?" I went downstairs. She tugged at the corner of her clothes. There were sawdusts between her fingernails. "I had a dream last night," another me said in the fog. "Don't believe what they say." She looked up at me, her eyes as bright as a freshly caught mackerel. "Who are they referring to? The witch? The village chief? Or the sea infant?" I finished for her. "It's dividing us." As we were squatting on the dock to discuss our plan, Omar's rickety fishing boat crashed into the shore with a loud clatter. The old fisherman fished out a tin box from the cabin, handed it to me, and left. Inside was a sketch of a reef monster claw drawn by his son, and on the back was written crookedly in pencil, "No waves in the tideless zone. The full moon night comes faster than the calendar." I stood in the middle of the rocky beach, with the copper bell given by Norman in my left hand, and a shell in my right hand. As the fog wrapped around my ankles, familiar cries came up. First a baby, then a mother, then Ivan's laugh, Marta's humming, and finally my own voice, floating up from the bottom of the sea. "Come with me to see the sea. I know you are here. I didn't close my eyes. You are our fear, not our enemy." The fog suddenly cleared. Omar's son held his doll, Ivan held Marta's hand, and Adianto's old dog wagged its tail. Their shadows had blood on them, like an old movie with the pause button pressed. "Welcome home," the shadows said in unison. Marta poked her head out from behind the reef and made an okay gesture. I took out my notebook and added a sentence under "Hai Ying is a mirror. The person in the mirror should learn to recognize himself." As the sound of the waves rose, a shadow moved in the fog. Dark grey coat, coin-sized scar on the back of neck, exactly like me. It didn't say anything, but turned and walked towards the tideless area. I held the shell tightly and didn't follow. When we were returning to the hotel, Marta caught up with us and asked, "What do you think the copy the witch was talking about?" "I don't know." I rubbed the scar on the back of my neck. "But after tonight, it's this that I should be afraid of." I couldn't sleep that night. It was 3 in the morning, and I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror shaving. When the blade touched the chin, the person in the mirror suddenly moved. He was not holding the razor, but holding a shell in his right hand, and the scar on the back of his neck was so red that it seemed like it was about to bleed. I stared at him, and he stared at me. The faucet suddenly turned on by itself, and cold water rushed down. A layer of white mist covered the mirror. When I wiped it clean, I was the only one left inside. The razor in my hand was dripping with water, and the shell was getting hot in my trouser pocket. But I know. It's waiting. Wait until next time. I'll ask the next question. At 3 in the morning, the razor was pressed against my chin. There was a thin layer of mist on the mirror. I blew on it and wiped it, and the reflection followed suit. As the blade scraped across his Adam's apple, the lips in his reflection suddenly moved. There was no sound, as if he was mumbling some secret words. I clenched the razor, and its right hand slowly raised up. It was not holding a razor, but a shell, exactly the same as the one that was burning in my trouser pocket. Look out the window. The shape of the reflected mouth suddenly became clear. I turned my head sharply. Ivan stood in the fog outside the vine-covered window. He was wearing that washed-out blue shirt, with engine oil still stained on his cuffs from the last time he repaired the boat. But his eyes were empty, as if the wick had been dug out. "What does it want from me?" I asked, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Ivan's mouth moved, and mist suddenly surged up and swallowed him. I was still holding the razor in the mirror, and the shell was burning painfully in my trouser pocket. The next day, I went to the village primary school. The principal, an old man with round-framed glasses, was handing out crayons to the 3rd graders. I waved my press card and said, "I want to ask the kids about the legend of the sea infant. Teacher Sulia knows best." He pointed to the door of the classroom. "She has taught lower grades for 10 years and tells stories well." My hand holding the notebook paused. 3 days ago, Omar said while drinking that Sulia fell into the crevice of the reef half a year ago, and it was he who fished out the body. The woman in the floral dress walked out of the classroom. She smiled at me, and there was translucent mucus between her nails, like jellyfish skin swollen by water. "Teacher Sulia," I flipped through my notebook. "I heard that you teach the children the soul-breaking ceremony." Her smile froze on her face. His pupils suddenly shrank into needle points, and he stared at the blackboard behind me, like a puppet with the pause button pressed. The principal coughed and said, "Little Quinn, do you want to go to the office for an interview?" I didn't move, staring at the goo under her fingernails. The thing glowed light blue in the sunlight, the same color as the claw marks and slime on the corpse on the reef beach. Met Hanem at the dock in the afternoon. He was holding a copper bell, and was the new night watchman. My brother disappeared 3 months ago, and his body floated in the tideless area for half a day before being washed ashore. "It's time to ring the bell." He shook the copper bell in his hand, and the sound was like a rusty gear. "You always run around in the fog." I squatted beside him and watched him stuff dried seaweed into the cracks of the copper bell. How does Hying choose his people? He suddenly raised his head, his eyes as cold as a freshly caught hairtail. "It will choose whoever is most afraid of it." The copper bell turned half a circle in his hand. "The more scared he is, the more his crying sounds like the ghost in his heart. Guess what he sees in your heart?" I didn't respond. The shell in my trouser pocket started to get hot again, burning my thighs. In the evening I stood under the old banyan tree in the center of the village. Marta stuffed a crumpled piece of paper into my hand. "This is the sacrificial spell of the witch Nerman. She said it can attract sea babies." I cleared my throat and chanted loudly. The tide receded and the fog rose. The baby's soul returned to the sea. As soon as the first sentence came out, the wind suddenly changed direction. The fog from the Banda Sea rolled in from all directions, wrapping around my ankles and rising above my knees. But the old lady selling fish was still counting money, and the uncle mending the net was smoking a cigarette, and no one looked up. Marta tugged at my sleeve. They can't see? My throat tightened. The sound of a baby crying could be heard in the fog, mixed with the lullaby sung by its mother. Exactly the same as the previous nights, but the people around him were doing what they were supposed to do. The boy selling coconuts even laughed out loud. "What is Mr. Quinn reading? It sounds like an opera." It turned out that Haiying was not hiding from them, but that they simply couldn't hear him. I became its trumpet, its megaphone. In the middle of the night, Marta and I tied the model on the rocky beach. She held up the mining lamp, and the light shone on the puppet's face. It was made of old clothes stuffed with seaweed, and had the same scar on the back of the neck painted on its face. "Is the anchor deep enough?" She rubbed her hands. Omar said, "There are no waves in the flat zone. It has to sink to the bottom of the sea." I tugged at the rope. Enough. The fog came earlier than expected. As soon as the puppet was pushed into the sea, all the shadows came from all directions. Ivan, Marta's shadow, and the shadow of Omar's son. Their feet did not touch the ground, and they floated towards the tideless area, like kites pulled by strings. I pressed the remote in my pocket. The high-frequency sound waves exploded with a buzzing sound, like 10,000 bees pricking your brain. The shadows began to twist, and Ivan's shadow screamed and tore its own face. "You can't fool it. It doesn't want my life." The fog suddenly cleared. There were only Marta and I left on the rocky beach, along with the sunken rope. The shell grew cold in my pocket, as cold as ice. When we got back to the hotel, the moon was already setting. I went upstairs in the dark, and just as I stepped onto the second floor, I heard a click sound downstairs. "Mr. Quinn!" It was Nerman's voice. She stood in the shadows, holding something in her hands that shone pearly white in the moonlight. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll show you something tomorrow." I said nothing. She turned and walked away, her shadow trailing like a piece of seaweed soaked in fog. The shell in my pocket suddenly moved and gently bumped against my thigh. I stared in the direction where she disappeared, and heard the sound of the tide washing over the rocks. This time, it wasn't an illusion. I was woken by the sound of a shell. I slept with it in my arms last night, and the edge of the shell made my thigh hurt. When I lifted the covers, the pearly white shell was lying on the sheets, with 5 crescent-shaped indentations carved into its surface, like some kind of claw mark. There was a knock on the door at 7 o'clock sharp. Nerman the witch stood at the door, her grey hair pinned with a silver hairpin, holding a faded cloth bag in her hand. "Look." She stuffed the bag into my arms, turned around and walked away, her slippers patting the bluestone road. Inside the cloth bag was a torn manuscript with pages falling off, and the cover was inscribed with Chao Ming Lu. Turning to the page with the red string, a line of words appeared in the ink. "Every 100 years, Haiying selects a resonant person, whose voice can attract fog and whose thoughts can touch spirits. It's not a curse." Nerman came back at some point, and dug her nails into my wrist. "It's a key." She rubbed her fingertips over the claw marks on the shell. "You can hear it, and it can hear you, but don't believe anything it says. It will weave its web through your memory." My throat tightened. "How did you choose?" "The deepest thread of fear." She released her hand. "The sea where your mother drowned when you were 12 years old is the same sea as the low-tide zone of Tanjong." The manuscript fell to the ground with a thud. The memories of when I was 12 suddenly came flooding back. On a rainy day, I held onto my mother's life jacket, and the last words she shouted before she was swept away by the waves, "Don't be afraid." And the voice outside the window 3 days ago, "Come with me to see the sea," overlapped perfectly. I squatted down to pick up the notebook, and my fingers touched the old camera bag under the bed. Inside was her mother's silver bracelet and a crumpled boat ticket. March 15th, 2009. From Jakarta to Ambon. The exact date of her accident. Someone knocks on the window. Hanium's face was pressed against the glass, his beard dappled with morning dew. I opened the door, and he squeezed in, locking it with his backhand. The village chief knew you were a resonancist. He took out the list from his pocket, and the edges of the pages were all burnt. They have been waiting for you to come back for 10 years. The first page of the list was my name. Elliot Quinn left the village on March 5th. The second page starts with missing persons, with dates starting from 2010 and becoming increasingly dense as time goes on. The last line of ink is not dry yet. Marta Rizani, November. She was tying puppets with me on the reef beach yesterday. I held the list tightly, and the corner of the paper dug into my palm. Impossible. It can tamper with memory. Hanam pulled off the copper bell around his neck. Go to the grocery store and find the back of her neck. I rushed out before I finished listening. The grocery store door was ajar. Marta had her back to me and was putting dried fish into a glass jar. There was a light blue mark on the back of her neck, as if it had been sucked by a suction cup. Mr. Quinn. She turned around, her eyes misty. Want to buy anything? I grabbed her wrist. Her skin was as cool as a shell fresh from the sea. Remember the puppet on the reef? I asked softly. Remember when we tied it and the shadow floated to the flat area? Her pupils trembled. The miner's lamp shines on the puppet's face. Her voice trembled. It has your scar on its face. Yes. I took out the shell that Norman gave me. Now I need you to help me do one last thing. She suddenly burst into tears. Tears fell on the dried fish. It always says I am redundant. Said my mom was dead. My dad was an alcoholic. Said no one would look for me. We're looking for you. I put Hanam's brass bell into her palm. Take this and shake it when you hear the sound of fog. It is afraid of the bell. She clenched the bell tightly, her knuckles turning white. Where are you going? Go to the tideless area. I turned and walked out. It doesn't want life. It wants the fear of the resonators. I have to cut this thread. The fog came when I reached the entrance of the village. First the ankles were entangled in the cold and wetness, then the knees and waist. My mother's voice rang in my ears. Shai, come here. It was the gentle tone of her voice when she taught me to sing a lullaby. Then Nora, my childhood best friend, said, You promised to watch the sea with me. And Ivan, the missing fisherman, smiled with blood foam. Do you think you can win? Finally, it was my own voice that seeped out from the fog. Give up. No one needs you anyway. I stopped. He took out his mother's silver bracelet from his pocket and put it on his wrist. Then he hummed the lullaby. The waves of the Banda Sea rock you gently. The fog suddenly cleared up. I saw the rocky beach ahead, and the water in the tidal zone looked like a piece of solidified blue glass. There was a cry behind me, like a baby, and like the wind. I didn't look back. The sea water was rising up at my feet, abnormally still. I took a deep breath and took a step forward. Suddenly a crack appeared on the water surface. When the sea water reached my ankles, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was something wrong with the water. It didn't have the flow of a tide. It was like a frozen block of blue jelly, and even the prints of my shoes didn't make any ripples. Suddenly, ripples appeared on the water surface, as if someone had thrown a stone into an ancient well. You're here. The sound came from beside his feet. I looked down and saw Ivan's shadow floating on the water. He was wearing the red plaid shirt he wore on the day he disappeared. There was still unwashed fish blood on his collar, but his eyes were empty as if his eyeballs had been gouged out. It's been waiting for you for a long time. The edges of his shadow were leaking water, like a soaked old newspaper. As soon as he finished speaking, the fog exploded with a boom. The cries of babies came from all directions, some as shrill as fingernails scratching glass, some with sobs and milky voices, mixed with my mother's humming when she coaxed me to sleep, Nora's aggrieved voice when she said, You promised to accompany me to see the sea, and my own voice. Last year in the hospital corridor, I held my mother's cold hand and said, Mom, wait a minute. These sounds formed a web, making my temples throb. I took out the shell that Noman had given me, and the prints of my 5 toes were still on my palm. She taught that putting a shell to one's ear can help one hear through the phantom sound. The moment it was pasted on, the crying sound suddenly became 3-dimensional. On the left is Nora calling out Elliot with the tone of her cry when she fell off a tree when she was 16. On the right is Sulia's little daughter, whom I saw at the dock 3 days before she disappeared, asking in a baby voice, "Where's Mommy?" The one in the middle is trembling with a sharp cry like a cat with its neck strangled. It's me, howling when I fell into the bottom hold of a fishing boat at the age of 7, and was almost fainting from holding my breath. Fuck. My throat tightened. These are not hallucinations, but people who have been swallowed by the sea baby. Their memories are pulled out like fish entrails and exposed to the fog. The high-frequency sound wave device in my trouser pocket began to vibrate. This is what I brought from Jakarta. It was originally used to record fishermen's oral statements, but now it has been adjusted to a mode that can counter infrasound. I pressed the switch, and the sound of electricity came out, colliding with the crying in the fog, like 2 knives being sharpened. It was no use. The fog only grew thicker, and Ivan's shadow grinned, his red checkered shirt bleeding. I gritted my teeth and turned the knob. Newman said that the sound waves of the sea baby are in the same frequency as human fear, and they want to break the sound with sound. I thought of the lullaby I had just hummed, the one my mother always sang when I had nightmares. The waves of the Banda Sea rocked me gently until the moon dozed off. His finger paused on the melody overlay key. I pressed it, and my off-tune humming came out of the device, mixed with the sound of electricity, and crashed into the fog net. The fog suddenly tore open. I saw an outline half a person's height, with skin like expanded plastic wrap, and vaguely visible purple blood vessels underneath. Its forelimbs had 5 hooked claws dripping with mucus. Its face was wrinkled like a crumpled baby's, but its eyes were a cloudy gray with no whites. Click. There were footsteps behind me. I turned around suddenly, and the splashing seawater wet my trouser legs. Marta stood in the fog, her hair dripping with water. The copper bell in her arms was still swinging, ding ding ding, hitting her trembling hands. "They used you as a substitute," she panted heavily, with broken shells on the corners of her clothes. "You will be sacrificed tonight when the tide rises. Use your fear to feed the sea baby." She suddenly grabbed my wrist. Her hand was as cold as ice. "I can't let you die alone." I stared at the pale blue mark on the back of her neck. It was moving, as if something was crawling under her skin. "Martha, look over there." She pointed behind me. Ivan's shadow appeared again. This time his eyes were no longer empty. Instead, he stared at me with the patience of a fisherman repairing a net, just like when he was alive. "You think you are fighting it?" His voice was mixed with the rustling sound of the waves. "In fact, every time you shake it, it will eat one more bite. Fear is the best bait." His shadow raised his hand and pointed deeper into the tideless zone. The fog was thicker there, and the outline of the reefs could be vaguely seen, like a pile of beasts with bared fangs and claws. "The real enemy is not the sea baby," he said, "but those who put fear into its mouth." Before he finished speaking, the sea suddenly surged. Marta screamed and was staggered by the waves. When I supported her, Ivan's shadow had turned into black foam and melted into the water. The fog came down again. This time what I heard was not crying, but some kind of sticky friction sound, like claws scraping against rocks. Marta clutched my sleeve tightly, and the brass bell swung between us, making a tiny sound. "It's coming," she whispered in my ear. I took out the silver bracelet and put it on her wrist. The mother's bracelet, which carried her body temperature, just covered the mark on the back of her neck. Then I grabbed the sonic device and took a step deeper into the tideless zone. When the seawater reached my knees, I looked back. Marta stood at the edge of the fog, the copper bell shining in her hand. The mist in her eyes disappeared. and they were as bright as fishing lights. "Wait for me," I said. Something under the water entangled my feet, slippery and slimy. I didn't bow my head. Ivan's words turned in his mind. The real enemy is the one who creates fear. The screams of the sea baby were heard in the fog, this time mixed with a deep laugh. It sounded like a human, yet not like a human. I pushed the volume on the sonic device to maximum. The lullaby, the sound of electricity, and the sound of Marta's bell all crashed into the fog. The fog ahead suddenly opened up a path. I saw a rock covered with claw marks. There was a shadow standing behind the reef. Not Ivan, not Hying, but a man in a black raincoat, with his back to me and a miner's lamp in his hand. The light from the mining lamp shone on the reef, revealing a line of newly carved words. On the 7th night, the resonators return. The underwater objects were getting tangled tighter and tighter. I took out the shell from my pocket and put it to my ear. This time I heard something different, not crying, not shouting, but some kind of whisper like someone saying, "Come here, talk." Marta called my name from behind. I didn't respond, staring at the shadow behind the reef. I walked towards it step by step. When the sea water reached his chest, the shadow turned his head. His face is exactly like mine. The slime from that underwater thing climbed up my trouser legs, making the back of my neck feel so cold. When the shadow behind the reef turned around, I almost bit my tongue. That face was exactly the same as my own in the mirror. Even the scar on the left eyebrow left from reporting a mining disaster was exactly the same. "Elliot Quinn," it said, its voice like two rocks rubbing against each other. "Or should I call you Resonator?" I clenched the sonic device until my knuckles turned white. Ivan said the real enemy is the one who creates fear. Ivan's shadow was eaten by the sea baby a long time ago. It tilted its head. The one talking to you now is you. The water reached my chest, and I could hear my own pounding heart. What if I could change its sound network, so that it no longer mimics fear, but hope? Shadow suddenly smiled, his mouth stretched to his ears. "It lives on fear, just like a fish lives on water." He wanted to drink sugar water. It raised its hand and the mucus on my ankle suddenly tightened. "Go back, Mr. Reporter. You should not interview the sea baby, but those who stuff fear into its mouth." "Elliot!" Marta's scream pierced the fog. I turned around and saw her sitting on the rocky beach, with the bell rolling into the waves. When I turned back, the shadow had turned into black mist, and the mucus under the water loosened up with a swish. I staggered back, the waves hitting my face, so salty and bitter. It was just dawn when we returned to the village. The witch Nerman was squatting under the old banyan tree at the entrance of the village, turning a shell in her hand. "You smell of it." She didn't look up. "It's not the smell of the sea. It's the acid of fermented fear." I wiped the water off my face and asked, "Can you help me?" She finally raised her eyes, mist floating in her cloudy eyes. "You are no longer an outsider." She took out an old book with a brittle cover from her bosom. The cover was pressed with faded five-toed paw prints. Part of it is also part of us. These are the notes of the resonators of past generations. They have all tried. Tried what? Negotiate with it. She pressed the book into my hands, but few come back alive to tell the results. That night I heated up the recorder in my hotel room. The phone screen was on, showing the voice prints of the sea baby that I recorded over the past 3 days. The baby's cry on the first night, the mother's little Ellie on the second night, and the help from my best friend Amir on the third night. I cleared my throat into the recorder and said in the tone of someone trying to soothe their little niece to sleep, "Mom is here."
The mother in the recorder suddenly got stuck, like an old cassette radio.
I pressed the pause button and replayed the video. There was indeed a half-second gap between the words "little Ellie." Someone knocks on the door. Kanam stood outside the door, the night watchman's bell hanging on his waist, making a tiny sound. "The village chief asked me to keep an eye on you. He walked straight into the house. But my son also disappeared last month. He took out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. On the yellowed list, the 4 words Marta Rizani hurt my eyes. The village chief knew you would come. He lowered his voice. 20 years ago, when the last resonance left, he left a message. When he comes back, the sacrifice will be complete. I clenched the list, my knuckles turning white. When did Marta? Not yet, he interrupted me. But they need a perfect sacrifice. The hungrier the sea baby is, the more the villagers will believe in the witch, and the more power the witch will gain. I suddenly remembered the book that Nerman gave me. There was a yellowed photo between the pages. A man in a black raincoat holding a mining lamp, with the background being the reefs in the tideless area. Exactly the same as the shadow I saw in the fog. I was tying lead weights to the human puppet when Marta knocked on my door. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, holding the silver bracelet I gave her. "Wear this tight." I pulled off the red string at the back of her neck, revealing a pale blue mark, exactly the same as the resonator mark drawn in Nerman's book. "When I throw the puppet into the tide-free zone, you press this button." I handed her a remote control. High-frequency sound waves can disrupt its sound network. The fog was even thicker in the tideless area late at night, so I waded into the sea carrying the puppet on my back. Marta stood on the rocky beach, her silver bracelet gleaming in the moonlight. 3, 2, 1. I let go of his hand. The moment the puppet sank, the fog was like water being drained away, and all the shadows rushed in that direction. I pressed the standby button in my pocket, and the whole village was filled with a shrill buzzing sound. A roar came from the fog. It was the shadow I saw in the tideless zone. "You can't fool it. Fear is its blood." The voice stopped abruptly. I was squatting on the reef, catching my breath, when Marta rushed over. The copper bell in her hand disappeared at some point, and was replaced by a shell with 5 claw marks engraved on it, glowing faintly in her palm. "Granny Nerman came to see you just now." She handed me the shell and said, "This is the key for you." The shell felt hot against my skin, and I could hear an inaudible whisper from inside, like ocean waves or some ancient song. "The fog is coming up again." This time, I didn't hear any crying. The shell that Marta had stuffed into my pocket was still hot. I had just put it in my trouser pocket when there was a knock on the door. Mother-in-law Nerman's shadow squeezed in first. She didn't turn on the light, and only relied on the moonlight to outline her hunched back. I fumbled for her a chair, but she sat on the edge of the bed, holding my wrist with her hand that looked like dry bark. "Have you seen the shells? It's hot." I pulled my hand back, like a red-hot coal. "It's not a curse." She took out a cloth bag from her lapel and opened it to reveal an even older book. "It's a key. Every 100 years, the sea infant will choose someone who can hear its heartbeat. You are the one who resonates with it this generation." My throat tightened. "Can it affect it?" "You can also be affected by it." She turned the pages of the book slowly, and the pages rustled. "Do you think those cries are random? It is searching your mind. Whatever you are afraid of, it will become that." I thought of little Ellie, who got stuck in the recorder. His nails dug into his palm. The pain made him sober up. "How do you prove it?" "When you were 12 years old, did you see your mother fall into the sea at Surabaya port?" she suddenly said. I raised my head suddenly. The moonlight leaked in through the window, and I could see the light in her cloudy eyes. "It was a high tide that day," she said in a voice as soft as a sigh. "You squatted on the breakwater and cried. Your tears fell into the sea. The sea baby tasted the saltiness and remembered you." I took 2 steps back and hit my lower back on the corner of the table. Memories of when I was 12 suddenly came flooding back. The salty wind, my mother's red sari being swept away by the waves, and me kneeling all night clutching her silver bracelet. The first time I heard a baby cry was during the rainy season of that year, in a rental house in Jakarta. "It doesn't choose randomly," I murmured. It's looking for the deepest thread of fear. Noman closed the book. Smart kid. That's why the village chief and his men have been waiting for you for 20 years. When the last resonator left, he said, when he comes back, the sacrifice will be complete. They want to feed you to the sea babies in exchange for peace in the fishing village. Marta's name is on the list. I took out the crumpled paper Hanam gave me. Hanam said so. That child has a mark on the back of his neck. Noman stood up, her thin body wrapped in a black dress, like a shadow. Same as you, they want to match them up to make the sacrifice sweeter. She walked to the door and looked back. Don't sleep tonight. Hanam will come. The door closed with a creaky sound. I dug out an old photo from my drawer. A photo of me at 12 years old, clutching my mother's silver bracelet, with the breakwater of Surabaya port in the background. There are faded words on the back of the photo. Little Ellie, stay strong. There was the sound of a bell outside the window. Hanam's shadow was stuck to the glass, like a leaf blown crooked by the wind. The village chief hid the boat in the warehouse. He took out a cigarette as soon as he came in, but his hands were shaking so much that he couldn't light it. They planned to wait for the foggiest night and tie you up to a tideless area. Marta's name was just crossed off to the last one yesterday. I unfolded the list. The 5 words Marta Rizani were circled 3 times with a red pen, and the ink spread out like a ball of blood. Where is she?
In the grocery store. Hanam put out his cigarette. Her eyes were fixed. I called her this morning, but she didn't respond for a long time.
I grabbed my coat and ran outside. The lights in the grocery store were still on, and Marta was leaning over the counter, a silver bracelet dangling on her wrist. I called her name and she slowly raised her head. Her pupils were dilated, like 2 drops of ink dissolving in water. "Ailey," she said, her voice trembling. I heard my dad calling me. He said the tide was coming in, and we should go home." I held her hand. The mark on the back of her neck was darker than yesterday, like a crawling snake. "Remember our plan?" I put the bell into her palm. "After I leave, press the remote control. High-frequency sound waves can disrupt its web." She nodded, tears falling on the bell. "I don't want to be controlled by it anymore. It makes me dream about my dad, and I dream about him saying, 'Marta, go to the sea with Dad.' No more." I took out the shell and put it on the back of her hand. "Here's yours." Merman said it can keep out the fire for a while. She suddenly grabbed my wrist and asked, "Where are you going?" "To a tideless area." I pulled my hand away. "It wants me. I have to cut the string." She opened her mouth but said nothing. The moonlight shone through the window, and the tears on her face shone. The fog in the tide-free area is thicker than at night. I waded forward in the sea, the salty smell choking my nose. My ears began to ring. First my mother's little Ellie, then Nora's laughter, my childhood best friend, who died in a car accident, and then Ivan's Mr. Reporter helped me find the anchor. When his body was found on the rocky beach, the anchor was missing. Finally, my own voice came out of my throat. "Elliot, your mother died because of you. You were squatting on the seawall crying and didn't hold her back." I bit it until it bled, and the fishy smell overwhelmed the seawater. I hummed the lullaby my mother used to sing, out of tune, like a broken gong, but the sound gradually faded away. The fog was like a veil blown away by the wind, revealing the outline of the reef. The water in the tidal zone suddenly surged. A shadow floated up, translucent mucus dripping at my feet, and 5-toed paw prints sank into the sand. When it spoke, it was Marta's voice. "You can't fool it. Fear is its blood." I pressed the standby button in my pocket. A sharp buzzing sound tore through the fog. The shadow screamed, shattered into a piece of phosphorescence, and sank into the water. The fog completely dissipated. I stood on the reef, gasping for breath, and heard a cry behind me, like a baby, and like the wind. Didn't look back. It was just dawn when we returned to the village. Marta was waiting for me at the entrance of the village. a copper bell ringing in her hand. Her eyes brightened up and she smiled at me. The remote control was pressed. It seemed afraid of that sound. I nodded, my throat tightening. Nerman's voice came from behind. "Follow me." She walked out of the village. Her shadow stretched long by the morning sun. I followed and heard her whisper, "The secret of the shell is not yet finished." The wind blew sea fog in from afar. I had just taken off my wet rubber shoes in the evening when there was a knock on the door. The door opened a crack, and Nerman's face squeezed in. She was holding a shell in her hand. The moonlight filtered in from behind her, making the patterns on the shell look like a scabbed scar. "Here." She stuffed it directly into my hand, digging her fingernails into my palm. "It's engraved with the paw print of a sea baby. But prayer can stop it from reading your mind." "Didn't we talk about shells during the day?" I pinched the shells, and the lines on them hurt my hands. She squeezed into the house, and the door creaked on its hinges. "Waiting for you to speak." Her Adam's apple moved, then she suddenly pointed out the window. "The fog tonight is thicker than usual." I looked in the direction where the fog had spread to the edge of the fence, like a ball of cotton wool that would not melt, sticking to the bamboo fence and dripping down. "It knows you're back." Her voice trembled. "Listen, no matter who calls you later, don't answer." I grabbed her wrist and asked, "What do you know?" She shook me off, and as she turned around, the corner of her clothes brushed against the sacrificial scroll on the corner of the table. It was the scroll Omar had stuffed into my hand yesterday. The edges were brittle and full of crooked symbols. "When you try those sounds, you'll understand." The door slammed shut. I took out my recorder. Over the past few days, I have recorded 12 clips of crying, from a baby crying to a mother's, "Little Ellie." It's all in there. There was a note tucked into the third page of the scroll, written in Omar's handwriting. "Respond to it with its voice. Listen to its voice." I pressed play. The first sound was a baby crying, as sharp as a needle piercing the eardrum. I tried to ask in a calm tone, "Who are you?" The recorder didn't respond. The second sound was the mother's "Little Ellie," and the ending sound was wet as if it had been soaked in seawater. I imitated her voice and whispered, "Mom is here." There was a sudden noise. My hands shook and the recorder fell on the table. Amid the sizzling sound, an unfamiliar voice seeped out, like bubbles rising from the bottom of the sea. "You shouldn't understand what we are saying." I hit the pause button, my heart pounding against my ribs. The sound was not human, but rather like countless throats squeezed together, with a fishy smell of the sea. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I knocked on the door of the village chief's house. A gianto was wearing batik pajamas, and holding a cup of tea, as if he had expected me to come. The sacrifice list. I slapped the crumpled paper bowl I stole from under Marta's pillow on the table. The names of the 5 fishermen who disappeared last month are all on it. He didn't answer, but tapped the mural on the wall with his knuckles. In the faded paint, a man stood at the edge of the tideless zone, surrounded by translucent shadows, with claws on his shoulders. He is the first resonator. His voice was as light as a sigh. The sea baby needs someone who can understand what he says and bring him ashore. "So you're sacrificing people?" I clenched the paper. He suddenly laughed. "Do you think we are doing this voluntarily?" He pointed to the eyes of the man in the mural and said, "The sea infant will let them dream of their closest people and say, 'Come with me to see the sea.' Just like Marta." "What about me?" My throat tightened. He stared at me. "You are the last one. Fog in tide-free areas is thickest in the early morning." I walked on the rocks, and my heels hit the stones, making a harsh sound.
"Mr. Reporter."
I froze. The voice came from the left, just like Ivan's voice when he was alive, with a nasal tone. His shadow floated on the water, semi-transparent, and he could see the reefs underneath. "You think you're controlling it?" He raised his hand and poked my chest with his fingertips. "It's learning from you." learning your fear, learning your will. How did you? It lets me speak. His shadow began to blur. When it can imitate your voice and say, "Come with me to see the sea," before he could finish his words, fog suddenly came over and covered his face. It was just dawn when we returned to the hotel. When I opened the door, Lena was squatting beside my bed, holding the shell that Norman gave her. "You stole my things?" I rushed over to snatch them. She looked up, her eyes unusually bright. "I want to try if it can talk to me." She put the shell to her ear. "You see, it's useless." A baby cried outside the window. Lena's pupils suddenly dilated, like 2 drops of ink dissolving in water. She opened her mouth, but the sound that came out was not hers. It was hoarse like sandpaper rubbing against stone. The tide rises and falls. The sea baby claims life. Those who resonate return. There is no gate for life without the tide. I snatched the shell away. She collapsed on the ground, trembling all over. "I just saw my cousin," she said. "Come with me to see the sea." I helped her up, my back covered in cold sweat. When I lay in bed at night, my eyelids felt so heavy that I couldn't lift them. I felt myself sinking in a daze. It's not a bed, it's water. It was foggy all around, and I could hear the sound of waves, very close and yet very far away. There was a voice ringing in my ears, like my mother, like Ivan, like myself. "Go to sleep, little Ellie." I wanted to open my eyes, but I couldn't move. A shadow emerged from the fog, and its 5-toed paw prints created ripples on the water. When it spoke, it was my voice. "Come with me to see the sea." I was awakened by a sharp pain in my wrist. In the darkness, I stared at my left hand. 5 red marks crawled from the wrist bone to the back of my hand, as if it had been scratched by some sharp claws. The lamp on the bedside table was shaking, the bulb flickering, and stretching the shadow on the wall into a distorted shape. There was a sob from outside the window. I rolled out of bed and stepped barefoot onto the floor. There was cool air seeping through the cracks in the wooden boards, as if someone was breathing close to the ground. The sobbing sound became closer. It was a baby's, with a hint of nasal congestion. I reached for the pen on the bedside table, and the metal cap hurt my palm. Suddenly, something fell from the shadow of the ceiling. I took a half step back, and the thing fell to the ground. It was a small, translucent body. It tilted its head back. Its eyes were 2 black holes, and its mouth was stretched to its ears, revealing its pointed milk teeth. What was even more disgusting was its hands. There was mucus hanging from its 5 hooked claws, which were dripping onto the wooden floor beside my feet, corroding small pits that made sizzling sounds. "Mom, save me," it spoke. The sound was like a crumpled tape, the sound of me crying when I was 12 years old. It was a rainstorm that day, and I fell into a gutter on my way home from school. I curled up under a bridge, soaking wet, and shouted "Mom" for 20 minutes, until the neighbor uncle pulled me out. "You are not me." I clenched the pen and pointed the tip at its eyes. It suddenly laughed, and its laughter was mixed with Marta's screams, Ivan's coughs, and the whisper of "come with me to see the sea" in the fog last night. The red mark on my wrist began to heat up, as if it was being roasted by fire. Its claws slowly extended, leaving sparks on the floor. Bang! The windows were banging loudly due to the wind. I turned my head sharply, and when I came back, the thing was gone. The slime on the floor was still steaming. In the shadows on the wall, countless little heads were shaking. Every pair of eyes was black and their mouths were open, repeating silently, "Mom, save me." I turned on the light, but the brightness was so blinding. There was nothing on the wall except my own shadow, which was stretched out like a skinned fish. At 5 in the morning, I was squatting in the corridor, smoking. The door of Marta's room was ajar, letting in a dim light. I walked over and saw her sitting by the window with an old sketchbook on her lap. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes seemed to be drained as she stared straight at the sea fog outside the window. "Martha," I knocked on the door frame. She didn't move. There was a vague humming sound in his throat, as if he was singing something. I leaned in to listen, and it was an old-fashioned lullaby, the one I heard in the village, the tune that old grandmas would hum to soothe their children. "Martha," I reached out and touched her shoulder. She suddenly thrust the sketchbook into my arms. The pages were filled with distorted drawings, translucent little bodies, 5-toed claws, and a path over a rocky beach that ended in a sea shrouded in mist. Exactly the same tidal zone in the sketch Omar had given me.
Hai Ying wants to go home. She suddenly turned her head to look at me. Her pupils dilated like ink. It said, "Come with me to see the sea." I took 2 steps back and dropped my sketchbook. She began to hum the lullaby again, her voice becoming softer and softer, as soft as bubbles in the sea mist. At 10 o'clock in the morning, I found Hanum at the dock. He was wrapping a red string around a copper bell. The night watchman's bell would ring at 9 o'clock every night to remind the villagers to close their windows. "You didn't ring the bell last night." I squatted next to him. He didn't look up. "It's no use knocking." "Why?" "Because Hying doesn't care about hearing the bell now." He tied the red rope into a knot. "We night watchmen don't live by ringing bells. We live by dreams." He finally looked up at me, his eyes like ice. "At 12 o'clock every night we have to enter Hying's dream and tell it to be quiet and don't come out. Otherwise it will go crazy and drag the whole village into the fog." What now? I thought of those little bodies in my dream last night. Now, he pulled off a red string. "There are new voices in my dreams." He tapped his temple with his knuckles. "It's your voice." My throat tightened. "What's that sound?" "You are shouting, 'Come with me to see the sea.'" He hung the bell back on his waist. "Just like Marta, just like Lena, just like everyone else who wants to be a resonator." At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Norman took me to the secret room behind the village. It was a small stone house with a dozen portraits hanging on the walls. The people in the paintings had strange expressions in their eyes. They seemed to be looking at something, or being stared at by something. "These are the resonators of past generations." She lit 3 incense sticks. In the smoke, the eyes on the portraits seemed to move. "They can understand Haiying's words, and Haiying can understand them too." She pointed to a painting on the far right. The man in the painting was wearing a faded shirt and holding half a shell in his hand, exactly the same as the one I had snatched from Lena. He tried to change Haiying. Norman's fingers ran across the frame. He made Haiying imitate laughter, the sound of waves and all sounds that were not scary. She suddenly laughed, very lightly, but he failed because he didn't learn to listen. She inserted the incense into the incense burner, and the sparks flickered in the smoke. Haiying is not a monster, but a lost child. It cries because no one listens to it, saying, "I'm scared, so what should I do?" "Let it hear your real voice." She turned to look at me, with light in the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. "It's not the voice of you shouting, 'I'm not afraid,' but the voice of you shouting, 'Mom,' under the bridge when you were 12 years old." At 6 in the evening, when I returned to the hotel, I heard Lena screaming. She huddled in the corner, her knees pulled up to her chin, with translucent mucus hanging from the corners of her eyes, like tears or glue. Between the fingers of her right hand, translucent webbed membranes grew, opening and closing with her breathing, like fish fins. "It wants me to die for you." She suddenly rushed over and grabbed my wrist. The webbed membrane pressed against my skin. It was freezing cold. It said that if I go with it to see the sea, you can live. I pried her hands apart, and she collapsed on the ground, crying out of breath. "But it also knows you won't let anyone replace you." I squatted down and wanted to wipe her tears. The mucus from the corners of her eyes stuck to my fingertips, with a salty smell like the water from the Banda Sea. At 10 o'clock in the evening, I sat by the window and smoked. The light was still on in Marta's room, and her shadow could be seen on the wall, still drawing those paw prints and paths.
The sea mist spread over the windowsill and stuck to the glass like a layer of gauze. There were footsteps downstairs. I looked out and saw Norman walking out of the village with a bamboo basket on his back. The moonlight shone on her shoulders, and half a stick of incense was visible in the bamboo basket. It was used for sacrificial offerings, 3 times thicker than usual, with a red rope wrapped around the top. She walked to the entrance of the village and looked back at me. I couldn't see her expression clearly. I just saw her lips moving as if she said something. The sea breeze blew, and the fog became thicker. I heard a baby crying in the distance. This time it was not outside the window, nor in my dream, but coming from the direction of the tide-free area, crawling towards the village, little by little. I put out my cigarette, grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and chased after him. Norman's bamboo basket flickered in the fog, like a floating lamp. She didn't walk fast, but always kept a distance of 5 meters from me, as if she was deliberately waiting for me to catch up. "Grandma Norman," I shouted. She didn't look back, but she paused. The moonlight leaked into the mist, illuminating the incense in her bamboo basket, thicker than a thumb, with 7 wraps of red rope around it, the same kind I'd seen in the ancestral hall. The tide receded on the rocky beach outside the village, revealing the dark rock surface. She squatted at the edge of the tideless area and inserted the incense between 2 reefs. It took 3 attempts to light the tinderbox, and sparks splashed on the back of her hand. She seemed unconscious and began to chant a spell. The sound was very light, like the sound of wind blowing through shells. "Grandma." I rushed over to pull her, but she suddenly turned around. The light in her wrinkles was gone, and her eyes were as bright as 2 stars. "I have lived too long." She grabbed my wrist with abnormal strength. "It's time to give up my position to you." The fog suddenly thickened. Her hand slipped from my wrist, and she took a step into the mist. 1 second you could still see the corner of her blue shirt. The next second all that was left was the incense stick on the reef, with the smoke twisting into a spiral and going up into the sky. Kaya Ying's crying voice changed, as if someone was strangling his neck. The heart-wrenching howls turned into intermittent sobs. I squatted down and touched the reef, and the incense ash fell on the back of my hand. Feeling cold, there were footsteps behind me. Marta's shadow cast on the reef was thinner than usual. She held a brass bell in her arms, the one that belonged to Omar, the one with the wave pattern engraved on it. "Martha?" I stood up. There was a gleam of water between her fingers, and the webbed membranes had already crawled to the base of her fingers. She knelt at my feet. The bell hit the rocks with a clang. I can't hear myself clearly. She looked up at me, the mucus in the corners of her eyes sparkling in the moonlight. Last night it imitated my mom and called me by my nickname, and I actually responded. I squatted down to help her, but she grabbed my hand and pressed it on the bell. "Use me as a bridge." Her voice trembled. "I can still squeeze in a little bit in its sound network." "No," I pulled my hand away. "Lena has already." Lena volunteered. She interrupted me, just like Grandma Norman. She smiled, and tiny beads of blood appeared at the corners of her mouth. "Why do you think they chose you?" "Because you can hear yourself." Haing's crying was getting closer. This time it was not just one, but a whole area, like hundreds of babies crying in the fog. Marta's body began to tremble, and the mucus on her webbed feet dripped onto the rocks, making a sizzling sound. "Please." She pressed the bell into my palm. "Let me be useful again for the last time." Before I could say anything, a shadow suddenly fell over me. Ivan's outline emerged from the fog, and this time it was not vague, and the buttons on his shirt could be seen. "It's not you it's afraid of." His voice seemed to come up from the bottom of the water. "It's you who are willing to bear the fear for others." He pointed at the copper bell in my hand. "You are not here to kill it, you are here to be it." "When is it what?" I yelled. He didn't answer, just looked up at the fog. The crying sound in the fog suddenly became louder, like someone scratching glass with fingernails. Ivan's shadow began to fade, And finally, only one sentence was left. Speak for it what it can't say. There were footsteps coming from the other side of the rocky beach. Ardianto was holding a flashlight, dressed in a suit and tie, and looked out of place on this broken rocky beach. His leather shoes slipped on the wet rocks. Mr. Elliot, he smiled, watching the sea at this late hour. I squeezed the bell. You know the resonators, I said. You know what Granny Nerman is doing. His smile froze. You've dug deep. Your son is not the first one to go missing. I took a step forward. In the past 30 years, every village chief has known about Haiying's case. He deliberately frightened the villagers and passed down the taboo. He did not deny it. Fear is the most stable rope, he said. The villagers are afraid of Haiying, so they will listen to the village chief. Those who listen to the village chief can survive. He spread his hands. What a good cycle. So you stopped Granny Nerman. I remembered Omar saying that the village chief didn't let him mention the matter of Haiying. So you let the disappearance case become more and more serious. She's old, he snorted. It's time to find an obedient resonance. He suddenly came close to me, his eyes shining. You know what? The last person who resonated with me was my dad. He taught me how to turn fear into votes. Haiying's crying sound hit the rocks and made my eardrums hurt. Marta suddenly grabbed my arm. Her hand was as cold as ice. It's coming in, Ardianta continued. As long as you promise to listen to me. Shut up. I shook off Marta's hand and walked towards the tide-free area. The fog was like a wet rag, sticking to my face. Marta followed, and Ivan's shadow followed, and Ardianto's curses were half swallowed by the fog. I stopped when I reached the thickest fog. I heard Marta's panting from behind, and her webbed membrane pressed against the back of my neck. Feeling cool. I'm going in, I whispered. Yes, she responded. I'll follow. I closed my eyes. When I was 12, the rain suddenly came pouring in. The water under the bridge was above my ankles. I hugged my knees and shouted, Mom, but my voice was trembling due to the sound of the rain. That was the last time I called her, and the next day wild chrysanthemums grew on her grave, a salty taste in the throat. I hummed half a sentence, and then stopped. Marta put her hand on my back and pushed gently. Go to sleep, my baby, I said, my voice shaking. The waves will sing a lullaby. The crying stopped. The fog began to recede. It was like someone was fanning it from behind, rolling it layer by layer into the sea. I opened my eyes and saw Marta leaning on my shoulder with her eyes closed, and her lips curled up. Her webbed fingers were gone, and her fingers were clean, as if they had never grown those things. The rocky beach is full of water. It's not seawater, it's condensed fog, and it glows light blue under the moonlight. There was a splash in the distance, like a large fish leaping out of the water. Ardianto's flashlight flickered through the fog. I couldn't hear what he was shouting. Marta's head dropped and I held her back. Her body temperature returned and she felt warm. Martha? I patted her face. Her eyelashes moved, but she didn't wake up. But I know she heard it. It was as if Haiying had heard it underneath those cries distorted by fear. There was actually the same sentence. I'm scared. Who will listen to me? Grandma Nerman's incense is still burning. The smoke floated up into the sky and circled around the moon. I touched the shell in my pocket, and it was exactly the same as the one of the man in the portrait. The sea breeze blew over, bringing with it a sweet smell. I squatted down and tied the brass bell around Marta's wrist. Her fingers moved and gently hooked my little finger. The fog has completely cleared. The water surface in the tideless area is as flat as a mirror, and you can see the stars falling into it. I stood up and walked towards the village. There was a faint sound of water coming from behind, like something was playing in the water. I didn't look back. I will go to the police station tomorrow morning, with Omar's sketches, with Grandma Nerman's incense ashes, with Marta's brass bell, but tonight I will keep her company. guarding this girl who walked into the fog for me, guarding this fishing village where I can finally sleep well. Haiying is still here, but it should know now there is someone who is willing to listen to it, cry and teach it to laugh. Like Grandma Nerman said, it's just a lost child, and a lost child will find his home one day. I sat down next to Marta and took out my cigarette case. As soon as I lit it, I heard a soft sound like bubbles bursting behind me, because I know that Haiying is imitating my smile. That's the end of tonight's story. Thank you for listening. Have a good sleep. Good night, dear wanderer.